Frank Miles was enjoying his stay on the Naglfari with his two children, Milton and Fiona. The trip was a prize for meeting his sales goals in selling fridges across Europa. So, as a way of saying thank you for a job well done, his work gave him a 2-week cruise on the Naglfari, headed from Portishead, Albion, to Imperial City in the Empire of the Seven Cities, where his wife, Violet Miles, would be waiting for them all. She works for the Emperor's staff and was considered too valuable to leave the Empire. The Emperor feared either her assassination, or worse, her arrest, of one of his most valuable staff. So, Frank went on the cruise alone with just him and his two kids. But he was excited to see his wife again for the first time in almost 8 months, since he spent most of his time working in Europa and was often in Gaul, and so was his kids. Frank watched as his children played in the water park while he idly read his book. He was mostly paying attention to his kids, but his kids often felt they had more fun when they thought he wasn't watching too closely. But they also felt safest knowing he was nearby. So, while he sat and relaxed, he thought about his wife's face and voice. She had some of the kindest eyes he had ever seen, and she had one of the most soothing voices he had ever heard. Her voice flowed from one word to another. Even simple phrases turned into poetry. It flowed through her normally. The only times her words didn't flow was when she was lying or trying to hide something from him. Violet was able to hide things from most everyone else, but when she tried to hide gifts from him or convince the kids that the gifts under the tree were totally from Mary Lloyd and not from their parents, her voice would turn into a stern lecture, every word and the intonation chosen carefully, and a tone of, "Don't question me." Even after 13 years of marriage and 2 children, Frank has never questioned her. While lost in thought of his wife, Frank's thoughts immediately turned to his children, an almost supernatural sense. Before Milton even fell, Frank felt himself tense up. While Milton was lying sprawled on the ground, processing the pain, before he could even open his mouth, Frank was already walking over to him. By the time Milton was crying, Frank was already crouched over his son, and already Frank could see a bruise forming on his son's knee where he tripped and skinned it. He fell, running next to the pool. Kissing his son's knee, he asked, "What happened?" "I fell." "Oh? Why did you fall?" "I was running." "Were you supposed to be running?" "No." Frank kissed the skinned and bruised knee again. "Does it still hurt?" "Yes, it burns," Milton told his dad. Frank nodded and held his chin like he was a detective solving a case. Milton loved it when his dad treated his problems like they were cases to solve. Even at 7 years old, Milton loved hearing about detective cases, and he even followed some of the cases of the detective Red Prince over in River City. So, naturally, it was a good way to distract his son from his own injury. Well, if you fell while you were running, do you think they were connected?" Milton nodded as a response, looking at his own knee. The blood was starting to blossom, so he was going to need an adhesive bandage, and he was probably burning from the salt in the water. The Naglfari had salt water in all of its pools, maybe to save money on chlorine. "I think you fell because you were running, and I think it burns because of the water in the pool. So, what do you think we need to do, Walton?" Frank asked his son. Walton was a reference to a sidekick in some of Milton's detective stories, so getting called Walton made Milton brighten up. Sure enough, it worked even now. Milton brightened up and looked deep in thought. "I think I need to go to the room, wash away the poison, and we need to cover my wound," he said, trying to sound like a serious doctor assistant. but he couldn't help smiling. He picked up a lot of big words, but he didn't always use them quite correctly. Still, in Frank's mind, it was a good start. Turning his back to Milton and crouching down, he called back, "Get on my back. We'll get you to the cabin and get you cleaned up and patched up," Frank said, before feeling Milton wrap his hands around his neck, holding his son, and he carried him on his back while he walked over to where Fiona was. She was swimming laps across the pool. She was a bit older than her younger brother, at 9 years old, but she enjoyed the feeling of swimming, much like she was a mermaid. Her swimsuit even had fake scales and sparkled in the water, just like a mermaid, from how much she loved it. "Come on, Fiona, we gotta get Walton here up to the cabin to patch him up," Frank called out to his daughter. She swam up to him, her head bobbing out of the water, her face in a deep frown. She even used her fingers to pull her frown down further, to make it very clear she was not happy about it. Fiona could speak, but she didn't like speaking where people she didn't know could hear her. Where Milton was a fan of detective stories and mysteries, Fiona loved stories of fairies and magical creatures. This often manifested in odd quirks, counting every step to make sure the stair wasn't infinite, refusing to give her names to others, not wanting to speak in public, and calling everyone she didn't know or didn't trust a fellow traveler. So, when she wanted to prove a point, she would often exaggerate her emotions. "Come on, princess, you can play games while I take care of your brother. Afterwards we can talk about dinner." Fiona stopped frowning and started to smile, even pulling up the corners of her mouth with her fingers to show how much she liked her idea, before lifting herself out of the pool and walking alongside her dad. Even though there were just 2 steps leading from the pool to the walkway, she counted them. Frank carried his son on his back and watched his daughter look down at the ground, refusing to look any of the fellow travelers in the eye and not wanting to lose count of the stairs as they gradually made their way to their suite. Walking down the hallway, Frank saw that there was a house cleaner who was struggling to keep standing. She was very pale, and every step was a struggle. One hand was grabbing at her stomach, while her other gloved hand held the wall to keep her steady. The house cleaner was facing away from them, but even facing away, he could see how pale and flushed her skin was. Frank began to walk towards her as carefully as he could, figuring that she was either seasick or having a rough night. Eager to get his kids away from her, Frank saw Fiona freeze, and she made 2 fists in front of her chest. One fist faced her chest, and the other hovered above it. The top fist almost touched the bottom one as it seemed to bounce up. Fiona was signing that there was danger. Looking at the house cleaner ahead, Frank figured it would be best to humor her. The house cleaner did look very sick, and if it made the kids feel safer to go a different way, then he would do it. Turning down an empty hallway, Frank half led and half carried his kids to the cabin suite. It took a few extra minutes, but they made it there without any incident, and without going near the house cleaner. And now, opening the door to the cabin, they went into the suite. The cabin suite was near the top deck. It had a master bedroom and an adjoining bedroom. The children would get the master bedroom, while Frank took the smaller bedroom. Partially it was so they could enjoy the larger room, but it was also good for Frank also. The master bedroom had a massive television with seemingly every game system known to humanity, and the adjoining room was small and quiet, perfect for Frank to sleep, while his kids could play games late into the night, as late as they wanted to. He took Milton to the bathroom and opened the first aid kit. As he began to clean and dress the skinned knee, Fiona stood in the doorway, like she was standing guard. "Why were you signing danger?" Frank asked her. Since they were alone in the cabin, she was more likely to say what was happening. "Babon Sith." She was going to bite us if we got close, Fiona explained just as Frank finished up putting the bandage on his son's knee. Frank remembered telling the tale of Babone Sith to Fiona. It was like a vampire. It was a fairy of sorts, but that could bite a person and either drink their blood or eat their flesh. Well, we are away from her, and safe here, right? Frank asked. Fiona eyed the door and then her dad before nodding. Safe, she agreed. Let's see if we can get changed before dinner, Frank said, before heading to his room to change. But before he could make it through the door, you heard the PA crackle to life, before the captain's voice came through and spoke. There has been an outbreak of bacterial meningitis on the ship. I am asking all guests and staff to quarantine in their cabins until Vanguard arrives to evacuate everyone. It shouldn't take longer than a few hours. Remember, do not open the cabin until the Vanguard arrives. The last word sounded almost worried. As a way of saying sorry for the inconvenience, all minibars are now complimentary. This time, it sounded like he was reading off a prompt before the PA cut out. Dad, what's quarantine? Milton asked his father. Well, it means we have to stay in the cabin so we don't get sick, until the doctors come and get us. Aww, both his kids said at the same time. They were disappointed they didn't get to keep playing in the water park and no dinner at the buffet tonight. Something that they all looked forward to each night. Still, Frank knew how to pivot the disappointment into joy. Do you know what complimentary means? Frank asked his children. Milton shook his head and Fiona shrugged dramatically. Does that mean the fridge is going to give us compliments? Milton suggested. Frank responded by shaking his head and looking at Fiona. When he asked these kinds of questions, he wanted answers from both of them. It helped make sure they were both involved in choices and in learning equally. Extra snacks? Fiona asked. Frank shook his head and responded. You're both kinda close. It means that all the snacks in the fridge are free as a set way of saying sorry and to compliment us. It took a moment before the realization dawned on his children. On the very first day they got on the shift, they asked for the snacks in the fridge, even though it was cheaper to get snacks pretty much anywhere else and bring them into the room. The fact that the children could see the snacks made them as tempting as cursed gold. The price was much higher to pay than they were willing to pay, but still it remained. Just behind the glass, with the light always on, there was choice candies, delectable delights, mouth-watering microwavables, and sweet sodas, all on display to the children. And since it was a suite, the fridge wasn't a mini fridge that could barely hold a carton of soda. It was a double-wide fridge taller than Frank was tall, with 2 doors side to side. Fit to feed a family of dozens, and it was stocked from everything from frozen fish fillets to simple Sunday supplies. Practically a buffet in itself. Already the children were running to the fridge and they tore open the doors, going through the candy first, following a child's logic of dessert first. Don't drink the tiny bottles, Frank warned before heading to his room to change. Even though they were on vacation, he didn't want them drinking alcohol. He wasn't worried, since he doesn't drink, and he doubted they would start in the 5 minutes it took him to change. Sure enough, when he came back in his pajamas, Fiona already had a pile of gummy centipedes and gothic raspberries on a plate, pretending that the centipedes were eating the candy berry as she ate them both. Milton had a bowl of whipped cream topped with chocolate shavings and hot dogs that he ate as ravenously as it was ambrosia. Glad to see you both like it, Frank said as he removed some fillets before putting them on the paper plates that came with the fridge. Microwaving it, he watched as his children ate up. Well, I think it might be a good time to watch some movies. What do you think? He asked as they both squealed in happiness, Movie, they said together, while Frank figured out the television that apparently took an engineering degree to figure out. Apparently, the captain made the movies all complimentary too. A wonderful bonus. Putting it on the newest movie to come into theaters, Frank ate impromptu dinner with his kids. It didn't take long for them to fall asleep. They were asleep before the big movie finale. Taking the paper plates and putting them in the trash, Frank checked the door to the cabin. The deadbolt was on and the latch was firm. Heading to bed, he checked on his children one last time. Both asleep in the master bed, the light of the movie splashing across them as he closed the door to his bedroom and went to his bed. Comfortably asleep and dreaming before he knew it. The quarantine was sudden, but he was quite proud with how quickly his children bounced back. Frank woke up the next morning to knocking at the cabin door. Groggily, he headed to the door, about to open it until he remembered that they weren't supposed to open it for anyone but the vanguard. Calling out through the door, he asked, "Who is it?" There was a pause, but a woman's voice responded, "Vanguard, here to evacuate you." Opening the door, Frank looked out to see strange figures in front of him. They both wore leather jackets, paper mask covers, and green shirts with a golden shield on the front, with golden antlers sprouting from the shield. Frank was not familiar with the symbol. He thought that the Vanguard had a snake on a stick, but they still seemed honest. "Please, we need to evacuate quickly. Please grab everything you need. Eat and let's go," the woman asked. Neither of them introduced themselves. The man kept glancing around like he was expecting a fight at any moment, and he carried a crossbow in his arms. It was, thankfully, aimed at the floor, but still a scary wake-up call. The woman had a more relaxed look and didn't carry any weapons as far as Frank could see, but there was a lot of curiosity in her eyes. Like she was seeing everything in the room at the same time, but the world had to catch up to what she was seeing. Yeah, can we get dressed? Get your shoes on, yes, but everything else gets into your luggage. Sure, okay. Frank responded by turning around to wake his kids. They were groggy, but they quickly got their shoes on when they saw the Vanguard there. Vanguard are emergency workers, filling in any role police couldn't do. They operate internationally, but they were especially popular in the Empire of the Seven Cities. As Frank had his shoes on and so did his kids, they grabbed their luggage. Fortunately, Frank always taught his kids to keep everything when they're on vacation in a single briefcase. Even in their room, all their clothes and important items were in the briefcases at all times, ready to grab and go. Frank had a bit of a fear that there would be a moment just like this, when they would have to leave quickly. In less than a minute, they were ready and joining the Vanguard outside. Despite the man with the crossbow staring down at them, neither Fiona nor Milton seemed afraid of him, and Frank also had to focus on staying calm. The man stayed in the back of the group, led by Frank, who wanted to watch his kids and keep some distance between the man and his children, and then in front of the children was the woman, who led the way. She then took them off the ship in one of the longest and strangest routes that Frank had ever seen. She would often take 3 lefts instead of 1 right, and before opening any door, she would rest her hand on it just for a moment and close her eyes. Almost like if she was trying to see if the door was hot, like there was a fire somewhere on board. Which, as far as Frank knew, there might have been. They didn't see anyone else as they trekked through the ship. There were lots of spilled clothes, dropped drinks, overturned chairs, and even briefcases, but no actual people. "What happened to everyone?" Milton asked. It was the woman who responded. Most of them already left. You were some of the last people to leave. But if most already left, wouldn't that mean there are some who didn't leave? Milton asked. It was the man who responded. Don't worry, we'll make sure no one is left behind. Something about the man's words felt like a cold fog washing over the group. Now near the tendering area, the woman hissed. Fuck! No way around. I need a favor from you all. I need you all to look down and follow my feet. Step where I step, and most importantly, don't look up, she ordered. Why don't we look up? Milton asked. There were a lot of people who were sick, and when people get sick, sometimes they leave gross things behind. I don't want you seeing it. If you see the sick, you're going to get sick, she answered. This made sense to the children, who immediately kept their heads down, and Frank followed suit, watching his kids' feet ahead as they all stepped forward carefully. Still, curiosity piqued his interest. Glancing up for just a second with just his eyes, he saw the main play area of the ship, where just yesterday Milton and Fiona played in the water park. Now what Frank saw was only a glimpse, and it was only for just a second, but it was more than enough. The first thing he noticed was a lot of brown sticky fluid near the pool's edge and inside of the pool. At first, Frank assumed it was spilled soda, until he noticed something floating in the pool. It leaked something red as it bobbed on the small waves. Frank figured it was a pool toy at first, but pool toys aren't normally that big. Pool toys also didn't leak, and they definitely didn't leak red. And most importantly, pool toys didn't move while face down in the water. Frank felt the man's hand on the back of his neck, forcing him to keep looking at the ground, while they all headed to the tending area. Stay focused, he whispered to Frank. It was less ominous and felt more like it was giving advice. Deciding to follow it, Frank kept walking, and they all made it to the tending area with no other problems. When cruise ships make it to port, oftentimes people simply can't walk from the dock to the cruise ship. Tendering was the process of a small boat attaching to the cruise ship to carry passengers to the dock. Here, there was already a boat attached to the ship. Here, there were doctors in white scrubs with the snake and the stick symbol, and everything else, who saw the group approaching. The doctors rushed forward when they saw them and started asking everyone in the group strange questions. They even asked the odd man and woman, Are you nauseous? Have you or anyone you know recently vomited blood? Do you have any strange cravings or sudden increases in appetite? Have you or anyone you know recently got a fever? Have you been bitten by a rabid animal or person lately? After Frank answered no to all the doctor's questions for himself and for his children, who were too scared to answer the doctors, Frank couldn't blame them. In their full body suits, mirrored visor, and electronic voices, they more closely resembled aliens in a monster movie than they did benevolent healers. The doctors, after asking all of their questions, finally escorted Frank and his children to an even smaller boat, where there was a single cabin and a pilot house. The man inside the pilot house wouldn't respond to Frank at all. Even the door to the pilot house was locked. The man inside staring daggers at Frank and his children. Nowhere else to go, they went inside the cabin. Inside there were 4 small cots, a little toilet closet, and little else. The entire cabin was smaller than the master bedroom on the Naglfari. The small boat, barely bigger than a dinghy, began to cough to life and slowly make its way towards the shore. On the way back to shore, Frank and his children took turns telling stories and occasionally looking out of the window to see Oceanus. Even in the small boat, Frank and his children enjoyed the views of the ocean. After 7 hours in the cabin, they could finally see the shore approach. Finally near the shore, Frank went out with his children. Still all in their pajamas and the dock in sight, Frank could see a surprise. He saw his wife. "Look, Mom's here," he said, picking up both his children so they could see her. They both waved to her while she waved back. Frank couldn't be certain, but it looked like she might have been crying. When the boat finally docked and the gangway touched the dock, Frank and his kids weren't even off the boat before Violet ran on to kiss her husband and hug both her children. I missed you too, honey. When we heard about the meningitis outbreak, we just did what they said and waited in our room," Frank told her. "Meningitis? You were told it was meningitis? When I heard what was on the Naglfari, I thought... Violet's musical voice went up and down before it flattened and she spoke with precision. "I was worried you were sick. I missed you all so much." Her flat voice lied to her husband and children. Frank had heard his wife lie before. He heard the subtle speech when lying about Mary Lloyd to his children. He heard the perfect pitch when he denied hiding the anniversary gift. But if those lies were whispers before, then this was an air raid siren, screaming to Frank that she was hiding something huge. Before he could ask what she was talking about, he saw her pleading eyes. They glanced behind her, where Frank could see men pretending to work at the docks. It was subtle at first, but if you paid attention you could see it. A dock worker who would pick up a big pile of rope from a crate before moving it to another crate, then picking it up again and moving it back to the original crate. A fisherman who didn't have a cooler with him, but he had a rod that looked as new as tomorrow while he stood at the docks. Or how there was someone sweeping the same section of the dock, never bothering to move to a new section or even adjust their pace. "Hello, travelers," Fiona said in a tone that indicated she wasn't talking about fairies. "Well, I'm glad to see you again, honey," he said, smiling and kissing her again, as he felt her relax a fraction of a centimeter. She knew something he didn't, and as much as she wanted to tell him, it wasn't safe to tell him. The Emperor would be keeping a close eye on her and all of them, and this would remain a secret that she would have to bear alone. And even though he didn't know what really happened on that ship, he could tell that it really worried her. Frank would do his best to support her, to reassure Violet that he still trusted her, even when she had secrets and couldn't tell him everything. It would be tough, but the entire family had a lot of practice. They could all see the sword that dangled above Violet's head. She had money, she had power, she had influence, but the sword still dangled above her, suspended by a single golden thread. If she moved too quick, it would fall on her. If she spoke wrong, it would fall on her. If she acknowledged it, it would fall on her. If she even looked at it, it would fall on her. And the sword wouldn't just fall on her. Frank was aware, even though he couldn't see it, there were bound to be swords dangling above his head, and above Fiona's head, and above Milton's head. The only thing Violet could do was make sure that the thread didn't break. But even if she did everything she was supposed to, and stayed under the dangling death, pretending it was never there, never even looking up and doing everything she was told, and always doing everything she was supposed to, it may still fall on her and her family anyways, for any reason or no reason at all. and that was what she was afraid of here, but she couldn't speak about it. If she did, she would give the sword too much power. But it was clear to Frank, even if it was unspoken. Violet was afraid what happened on that boat was the swords falling onto her family. And now she was relieved that the swords hadn't fallen on them. Not yet, at least.
Timothy Gavin was at the pontoon table when the announcement was made throughout the ship that there was an outbreak of bacterial meningitis and everyone was to head to their room. Swallowing the rest of his rum in one gulp, he watched as many of the other lemmings in the casino left their tables. He watched as they wandered away from potential paydays. Some of them even left their chips behind, not even bothering to cash them out. Something that struck Timothy as dumber than burning bills to keep yourself warm. Timothy was a professional pontoon player, easily one of the best in the world. He played in Neapoli, in Carthage, and even in Newtown, and he was practicing his craft in the casino of the Naglfari. Another secondary prize he won from tying with a dealer 3 times in a single game while playing in Comet. The cruise was pleasant enough. The only downside is it was during the month where he had to spend watching Michael, his child. But fortunately, in addition to the world-class casino and buffet, the Naglfari had a kids zone that would watch his kid during the day. "Sir, last round?" the dealer asked Timothy. The dealer had a name tag on, but Timothy never bothered to check. The dealer was just the dealer, no matter where you went. Names didn't matter. Timothy had just won another round, and he easily tripled his money already. But he was so certain he could make 10 times that if the game just kept going. Especially since all the weak lemmings had already left. There was just the dealer, Timothy, and another man. Someone who introduced himself to Timothy earlier, but Timothy wasn't paying attention. Some kind of doctor or something? Dr. Fire, Dr. Fast, Dr. Festus, Dr. Hephaestus, Faust, something like that. "I'd rather keep playing if it's all the same to you," Timothy said. The doctor laughed and smiled. "I like the way this man thinks. You win some, so keep winning until you win it all," the doctor said with a large smile and wearing mirrored shades, even indoors. If Timothy was to guess, it would have been to help his bluff game. The captain did say we have to go to our rooms, and I could lose my... Before the dealer finished, the doctor removed a single golden coin from his pocket and placed it in front of the dealer. The coin was the same size as a pontoon chip, 39 millimeters. But being made of gold rather than plastic, it was a lot heavier than any chip had a right to be. But it was worth a lot more than even a purple or orange chip, but not quite as much as a gray chip. 1 aura per round. Think of it as a way of saying, "Thank you for your time. I don't think you get tipped this much normally," the doctor told the dealer. Timothy could see the wheels turning in the dealer's head. The dealer might make that much money in a single trip, but then again, he probably didn't. "I'm still not sure. Quarantine procedures are pretty strict," the dealer said, gently pushing the golden coin back to the dealer, who held up his hand. "We'll stop as soon as you want. Think about it. The 2 of us, a round will last, maybe 1 or 2 minutes. See if we make 21 or if you do. How many rounds can that make in 10 minutes? 5 or 10? That's 10 new gold coins for you. You can go from dealing to playing at that rate." The doctor enticed the dealer. Timothy was intrigued. Whoever this doctor was, he wanted to play him. He was confident, suave, and smooth. Everything that Timothy thought he was. But this doctor was something else. Fine, just for 10 minutes, the dealer agreed as he dealt out the cards. Already, Timothy could see he had great cards. An ace of spades and a queen of spades. A perfect 21. In Pontoon, the goal was to get as close to 21 as you could without going over. Anyone who already got a 21 had already won. Keeping his smile to himself, he waited for the doctor and the dealer to move. Sure enough, the dealer had a jack of hearts, and the doctor looked as confident as ever. The dealer flipped his last card, revealing an ace of hearts, and the doctor laid down his cards. An ace of diamonds and a king of diamonds. "Oh, I guess that's a push," the doctor said, removing another golden aura, setting it down in front of the dealer, before putting even more chips in front of himself, betting even more on the next round. Not one to be intimidated, Timothy raised his chips even higher. The doctor smiled widely, putting a single chip higher on his wage pile. Timothy responded by matching, adding just one more chip also. There was something in his opponent's smile. It reminded him all too much of those salesmen who knew that they'd already had the sale, and they were just sweetening the deal. Timothy glanced at his newly dealt cards. He had a 10 of clubs and a 9 of diamonds. A really good hand, even if it wasn't perfect. The first card dealt, flipped on the dealer's side, showed a 3 of spades, so the dealer laid another card on his side. The doctor wiggled a single finger, indicated he was waiting for another card to be dealt with him. Sure enough, the dealer dealt the card to the doctor. Then, with everyone putting their cards face down, the dealer flipped his cards first, revealing first an 8 of hearts with the 4 of clubs to go with the 3 of spades. A total of 15. Timothy flipped his cards over, revealing his 19. It would take a much, much better hand to win over that. The doctor flipped over his first card, a king of diamonds. Next, a queen of hearts. And his final card, the jack of spades. In professional games of Pontoon, like this, the deck was made up of 4 separate standard decks, so it's not unusual for cards to repeat. Still, 2 kings of diamonds in a row had about a 1 in 43,264 chance of occurring, give or take some. What was even more unusual was, regardless of what card the doctor got from the dealer, when he indicated he needed another card, the doctor would have won with 20 easily. Most professional Pontoon players would be happy with an 18 since you can't go over 21. A 20 on your opening hand? Timothy had not known a single Pontoon player, professional or amateur, who would ask for another card after that. Timothy felt his smile widen as he grabbed the chips on the table. The doctor produced another golden coin, giving it to the dealer. "Ah, a very good hand. It's a shame. I was hoping for an ace, but oh well, all is fair in cards and bars," the doctor said as he stood up, checking his watch. "I believe I've played long enough. But with any luck, I'll see you both in Imperial City." "Oh, you have business in Imperial City? What are you, a politician?" Timothy asked, tallying up his chips. The doctor certainly had the smile of a politician. Every hand he played, good or bad, His smile never faltered or faded. Timothy could imagine that smile on every screen in Imperial City, telling everyone that Princess Petal perished from pertussis. After asking the doctor, though, if he was a politician, the smile faltered for a moment. The doctor had a look of pure rage for a single moment. Timothy had never seen so much anger on one face before. It was like the doctor was a caldera about to erupt. But then the smile returned, and he chuckled softly for a moment. Oh no, just business, I'm afraid. I've never been one for politics. What, you have too much heart for it? No, nothing like that. Politics is just too honest a game these days for me to enjoy myself. With that last strange statement, the doctor stepped away from the table, leaving the last of his chips behind. And then after a moment, the dealer finally spoke. What's with that guy? Timothy shrugged. I don't know. Does that mean I get his leftover chips since you forfeit? The dealer shook his head. No, normally chips would go back to the house, and I've already broken enough rules that it is, so I'll be taking these, he said, collecting the chips the doctor left behind, while he pointed to the bank against the wall. I'm not sure if the banker is still there, but I'm betting on probably. If he's not there, please go back to your room and you can exchange your chips for cash later. You seem awfully calm while everyone else is panicking, Timothy pointed out. He did appreciate anyone who wasn't a lemming and doing what they were told just because it was what they were told. But then again, in his experience, dealers were the very definition of a lemming, always following the rule and, despite the nature of their job, never taking risks. Still, it was nice that this dealer stuck around. Well, this isn't the first outbreak I've experienced. I thought this was the Naglfari's first trip. It is, but it's not my first trip. Quarantine procedures are always the same. Everyone goes to the room for a few hours, the deck gets cleaned up, the doctor checks out the sick, then the sick stay in their cabins while everyone else has a good time. We'll probably do another announcement in an hour or so saying the Vanguard won't be coming. The dealer counted up his coins and started walking to the employees-only area. You better hurry, though. You don't want to get caught by security, the dealer warned, just before he disappeared behind the door. Now picking up his winnings, Timothy made his way over to the bank, on the other side of the now empty casino. Every other light was now off, leaving just enough light to walk by, if there was an emergency. Still, a cold shiver ran up Timothy's back from the all-too-quiet nature of the casino. Casinos were full of life and loss. That was part of what appealed to him. The bright lights above, the laughter of the winners, the cries of the losers, the loud voices of the dealers and the pit bosses balancing them all out. The smell of alcohol from nearly every table, and the sweet scent of a freshly opened deck when the dealer had a new game to sit over. But now, the lights were dim. The reds and orange seemed less energetic and felt more like a warning. Like there was a great tragedy here, and it was warning them of it happening again. The empty chairs all had no one sitting in them, but still Timothy could feel like there was something in every chair, and it was staring him down. An irrational thought he kept pushing down as he kept making his way towards the bank. As he stepped past chairs that were pushed back haphazardly, or in some cases left discarded on the ground. Lemmings, Timothy said to himself, not even willing to clean up after themselves. Glasses, cards, purses, and on one table, a pale rubber prosthetic arm was left behind. Timothy would have thought when the captain sent all guests and staff to the rooms, at least a janitor or two, would have stayed out on the floor and cleaned up the important parts of the ship, such as the casino. Who even knows what bacterial meningitis is anyway? I bet he made it up for some quiet time, Timothy said as he got closer to the bank. Unlike the rest of the casino, it was still fully lit up, with the words "bank" in yellow neon lit up, even though the K was already flickering, making it look like "ban" for a moment. The bank was well secured. 5 teller windows with bulletproof glass and only a small slot underneath to allow for the trade of currency for chips, chips for currency, or currency for currency. To both sides of the teller windows were 2 ATMs, allowing for the guests to pull out their life savings to spend on raffle wheels, one-armed bandits, pontoon, or bones. But the actual act of changing coins for chips was always handled by humans. People got easily upset by the idea of people counting their chips. They fear machine mistakes, and it felt impersonal compared to counting out bills or stacking coins, counting it alongside the teller, making sure they weren't cheating you. And of course, seeing the chips slide through the slot, counted one at a time, from the banker to the guest. That was a feeling that Timothy knew a machine could never simulate, especially when he came back with more chips than he left with. Then the banker's smile would falter, just for a moment, but then it would come back. This time fake rather than firm, and then Timothy would have the pleasure of sliding over the chips one at a time, and have the banker return with coins both silver and gold to exchange for the chips. Timothy would then leave with the satisfaction in his heart, and in coins in his purse. The best part of international cruise ships like the Naglfari, the banks with them had to deal with multiple currencies from all over the world. Sesterces, wen, shekels, reo, deben, daryak, and even quachli. But Timothy's favorite currency to get paid back in was from the 7 cities. While most of the civilized world had moved on from gold and silver standards to cotton and plastic blend bills or digital old transactions, the 7 cities still used copper, silver, and gold, with the imperial family's crest still on every single coin. Some politicians across Europa argued it was because the emperor was so old-fashioned. He was not willing to update from the 2200s to the 2700s, like everyone else, and that the next emperor would not be willing to change because of tradition. Some historians argued it was because the last few times they tried to transition from gold to bills, that there were riots in the street, so they were not willing to update. Nearly every business professional argued it was a good thing the 7 cities never updated from centi, denarii, and auras, because it gave the 7 cities stability and value that was never afforded to every other currency. Obviously, Timothy preferred to believe in the business professionals. The wealthiest individuals on the planet liked to keep the majority of their assets in the 7 cities. It was hard to trace gold auras and hard to tax it, when most countries the currency of the 7 cities was barely considered an asset, not even real money, and thus taxed at a much, much lower rate compared to bills that could go up or down in value quite wildly. There's even a story shared in gambler circles about a gambler who used sesterces during a 4-hour-long game of pontoon. He won the entire pot, chips worth over 100 times what he spent on the game, but when he went back to exchange his chips for sesterces, he was given less than what he had to start with. because there was a massive drop in value while he was playing, and he never got the news until after he exchanged his chips. Whether that story was true, or even realistic, didn't matter to Timothy. The important part of the story was if you tried to trust anything except Seven Cities Gold, then you were playing a much greater gamble with the bank than if you didn't choose the Seven Cities coin. Standing at the center window, the only open teller window, all the others had security gates down. Looking inside, Timothy couldn't see anyone there. But still, with how lit up everything was, the teller had to be inside. Maybe they were in the back, counting the chips and the cash. Growing impatient, Timothy rang the bell next to the window. The ding rang across the empty, dark casino like a pebble plunging into a placid pond. The peace now disturbed, Timothy let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But with the peace gone, and no consequences as far as he could see, he felt more comfortable to be allowed in the empty casino. It felt less like a library. Ringing the bell again before knocking on the bulletproof glass, he called out, "Hello? Can I get some service, please? Look, I know we're supposed to be in our rooms, but just let me exchange my chips for Senti and I'll be on my way." He could hear sudden movement and even a crash inside, but still, there was no teller. They must have fallen asleep and were just woken up. Or maybe they were drinking and were just now goaded into action. Another lazy lemming in Timothy's eyes. The one thing a lemming is supposed to do: follow directions. And this one can't even do that right. "You better get out here before I tell your manager. You have one job. Do it or you'll have no job," Timothy yelled at the glass, his voice bouncing off and echoing throughout the casino. He could hear shuffling inside that was gradually growing closer. Letting out a sigh, he rested his back on the divider separating the teller windows. And he checked his watch. Where did those 30 minutes go? He didn't spend that long at the table, did he? And while Timothy thought about his timeline, trying to figure out where the missing 10 minutes went, he heard a knock at the glass. Finally, Timothy sighed out loud as he looked around to see the teller on the glass. His first thought when he saw the banker was that he had to be drunk. The banker had a single outstretched hand on the glass, palms flat on the glass, and his face pressed hard against the glass, practically smashed against it like a surrealist piece of art. The teller's eyes were yellow as egg yolk, with streaks of red from the blood vessels, spider webbing from the dark pools of pupil and iris, both now the same dark color. The teller's lips were pulled back with his dry tongue licking the glass separating the two of them. His teeth had something red dripping down onto the floor and smearing on the suit, tie, and glass. His suit and tie both disheveled and even torn, revealing more pale skin underneath. The name tag looked like the dealer's tag, but with a different, unimportant name. All of his skin looked cold and clammy, like he spent an entire night out on the deck with nothing protecting him from the ocean. But the most disturbing thing was when Timothy noticed that the teller only had one hand on the glass, because he only had one hand to give to the glass. Where the other arm was, it was much shorter, but the hand was broken off with the fractured pieces of ulna and radius bones sticking out, looking like the hook of a pirate who lost their hand at sea. At the tips of the bones were some fresh crimson, but the wound itself and much of the bones was as brown as the earth, the blood long since dead and clotted. The red dripping from the monstrosity's mouth didn't belong to itself. Whatever that crashing noise was, it was the teller's dinner, and Timothy had a strong feeling that what it was eating was human. Another knock on the glass. The hand and stump struck across the glass together, and the bulletproof glass, advertised as robber-proof across the world, began to crack from the strength of the dead man's blows. A haunting moan, sounding like something that belonged to the deepest underwater trench, or possibly the deepest pit of hell, escaped its lips. As Timothy saw it draw its arms back to strike at the glass again. Backing away, watching the abomination strike at the glass, creating yet even more cracks, Timothy felt safer watching it as he backed away. Somehow he felt if he turned away that the teller would break through completely. So he wasn't looking where he was going when he tripped over a chair, and he fell backwards. Slamming the back of his head to the ground, Timothy laid on the ground stunned. He must have laid there for some time, his thoughts too scattered to process what he was doing. It must have all been fake, some kind of prank on him. Surely he was going to stand up, and there was going to be some kind of camera crew and an annoying share my day personality that would announce how there was already over 1 million views, and Timothy would have to pretend that he already knew it was a prank. But standing up on his shaky legs, bracing himself against a card table, Timothy only saw the banker banging on the glass some more. The spiderweb of cracks were even wider than it was before, but the glass still held. No hidden cameras, no annoying personality, nothing but the dead man at the window, at least at first. But then Timothy noticed a figure who just entered the casino from the employees only area, stumbling through the shadows, seeking some super secret. Timothy, walking the best he could, on his shaking legs and bleeding from the back of his head, that he barely noticed. His first concern was to try to get help for himself. The dim thought of his son occurred to him, but he figured he had to get his chips exchanged for the coin of the 7 cities first. And then he could take himself to the infirmary. The kid zone would surely have a procedure for taking care of children when the parents were hurt. Right? Excuse me? I think your teller is doing a prank of some kind. I really need to exchange my chips, and then I need to get to infirmary. I think I'm hurt pretty bad, Timothy said to the shadow that was turned away from him. At the sound of his voice, the figure stopped stumbling and stood stock still for a single second before it started to turn and face Timothy. It was the dealer from before, but there was something very wrong. Bruises ran up his face and neck, likely continuing further under his shirt. His belly was torn open, and blood was starting to thicken to an almost jelly-like substance. His entrails were dangling below his belt like some disgusting party favor, and his face was the most terrifying part yet. His eyes still had the blank stare that he had at the table, focusing on nothing but aware of everything. The right side of his face was normal as ever, not a blemish. Even when he pulled back his lips into a smile, there wasn't even a wrinkle on his right side. The left side of his face was a different story. His left eye had a splash of blood that was starting to scab over it, and still no tears lied in that dried eye. His left side was always smiling. The lips and the cheeks were chewed and torn away by some unknown adversary, possibly by the teller that still banged on the glass behind Timothy. "Are you okay?" Timothy asked the dealer, who only let out a breathy gasp, something that was barely even a word, something that caused every nerve in Timothy's body to freeze. "Help," the dealer rasped, taking step after staggering step towards Timothy. Not sure what to do, he stood still while the dealer collapsed into him. The blood from his face smeared into Timothy's good suit, and his cold breath barely puffing in and out, but washed over his face. "Ew, you're breathing on me, and your blood is just so gross," Timothy said to the dealer, who only said one word. "Help." "Fine, let's try to get you to the infirmary," Timothy said, wrapping one of the dealer's arms around his shoulder and trying to drag him along. His cold breath washed over Timothy's face like a rotten fog. "Okay, you really have to stop breathing on me, or I'm just going to leave you here and then I'll go get the nurse," Timothy warned the dealer. It looked like it worked also. The dealer's breath had no longer washed across Timothy's face as he tried to carry and drag him to the infirmary. "Can't you at least try to help me a little?" Timothy asked the dealer. They had just left the casino and were now traveling down an eerie hallway. No one inside, and just like the casino, every other light was turned off. Apparently the cheap sea liner was trying to save money by keeping power costs low. Like constellations on a stormy night, these weak lights were all that guided Timothy to the red neon that marked the infirmary. "Come on, we're almost there," he said to the dealer, whose arm was starting to tighten painfully around Timothy. Still, even with the tight grip, Timothy was grateful that the dealer wasn't breathing in his face, even though their faces were just inches apart. "Can you loosen your grip? It's starting to hurt," Timothy asked the dealer, whose face turned to meet Timothy's gaze. Inches away, Timothy could see that the eyes were glazed over, and a milky white film coated them. His tongue dangled out of his damaged cheek, and his smile was still on his face. The dealer said breathlessly as his mouth opened, and he lunged at Timothy, knocking him down to the ground. The dealer's teeth tore into the meat of Timothy's upper arm. The pain was less than what Timothy was expecting, thank goodness, but the shock was worse than he was expecting. Laying there as the monster tore into him. Thankfully, his instinct to survive pushed him to tear his arm away. The dealer kept a large chunk of Timothy's flesh, enough to fill a handful of his own hands. Even with his prey gone, the cannibal continued to chew. Much of the meat spilled out of its torn cheek, only for it to be picked up and chewed again. The creature didn't care about its prey. Like a snake eating a lizard's tail, it got its meal, even if most of the prey escaped with its life. Now, with Timothy running the best he could, grabbing the ruined section of his upper arm through his torn shirt, trying to keep pressure on his wound while he traveled to the infirmary and slamming the door shut behind him. And sure enough, the infirmary, like everywhere else in the ship, was empty and only half lit, leaving Timothy to fend for himself. "What wheat?" he swore to himself while he checked the medical supplies. Bypassing the antibiotics, alcohol, and antiseptic, he grabbed the gauze and began to wrap his injured arm. It was already clotted over, but he didn't want to risk whatever happened to the dealer happening to him also. But he figured if he covered the injury, so whatever it wasn't going to transfer. Right? Still, even as he wrapped his arm in gauze, he realized that there was something wrong. Above and below the wound, blood vessels were starting to turn black. When he poked one of them with his finger, he realized that the blood vessel felt hard to his finger, but his own skin couldn't feel the finger. Whatever it is, it's spreading, he told himself. The infection was spreading, but that was only one symptom. The other symptoms he had a much harder time noticing. He didn't notice after he bandaged his wound, but he didn't hurt anymore. No pain anywhere in his body. His arm that was completely bitten was completely numb to all sensation, and the numbness was spreading. And with the lights low and very little all to see, he didn't notice as necrosis spread with the numbness. His skin starting to peel and weaken. He didn't notice that his breath was becoming cold, but he noticed when the air felt too hot, but he didn't notice pain, so he figured he had to be alright. I'll just stay here. Eventually the quarantine will end and the doctor can fix me. Michael will be okay. Michael, okay. Michael, soon. Timothy didn't notice as his heart slowed, growing weaker and weaker with every passing minute. His thoughts grew less crowded and more simple. One of his last coherent thoughts was about how he didn't even have the chance to cash in his winnings. Timothy didn't notice as he fell to the floor, his last breath taking on the floor, his eyes staring blankly at the door that he slammed shut, as his heart gave its desperate final beat. What woke up inside Timothy's body after he passed on didn't know things in the traditional sense. It felt hunger. Its senses saw no food, it heard no food, and it smelled no food. So what lived inside of Timothy pushed him to his feet and over to the door. It moved like a puppet with every string cut, but still it moved. The plague carrier and the plague were one and of the same. A malignant minion, mindless as its microscopic master. The deadly, dangerous, dead. The undead Timothy let out a raspy moan as it crashed against the door. By coincidence, and not choice. Choice implies consciousness. Timothy was able to get the door open when he crashed into it. Picking himself up, the creature continued its prowl, letting out a louder moan, one that was echoed by others of its kind. They were not yet seen, but still they were heard. There were others like Timothy. They were waking up, and they were seeking, just like him. The creature turned and stalked towards its next location. Not a choice, not a memory, not even instinct, but coincidental chance guided Timothy to his next location. The location still had its lights on. It still had noise emanating from it. And the bacteria swimming through what was left of Timothy's brain and body were attracted to light and noise. Again, not a choice, but much like how with the right conditions will cause a bacterium to thrive, and that's what they would swim towards, that was what Timothy sought out. The fact that the only place left on the Naglfari that had lights and noise on was the kid zone, where his son was still at, something that never crossed the creature's non-existent mind. Nothing would cross Timothy's mind ever again. Another moan escaped Timothy's mouth, and this time it was met with even more echoes. The infection was spreading, and if the infection could think, it would have been pleased.
Heather Kahn was pushing her cleaning cart from one guest cabin to the other, lost in thought and listening to her music to distract herself from the noise of the guests and also to distract herself from her own job. Over 20 years in housekeeping. She started immediately after she graduated from secondary school. She was balancing buckets and scrubbing ceilings. At first, it was what she did to help pay for classes, but then classes had to be put on hold for rent, and then a hold became a drop, and eventually the drop became permanent. Every year, she was promising to herself that she would return to school, take night classes, look into community college, take some online certifications, take advantage of the free classes at her library. All promises that were eventually broken by herself. Housekeeping in her small town barely paid more than minimum wage, and rent was barely covered by minimum wage. After a long hour of cleaning rooms, some mostly cleaned, others essentially trashed, she would go home barely able to eat and sleep before going back to work again. Before she knew it, she was looking at 40, and she was still struggling to make rent. The night she decided to work on the Naglfari, she had 3 different letters in her hand. The first letter was from the hotel she was working at in Portishead. It was an announcement that there was going to be wage freezes this year, and bonuses were not going to be paid out this year either. Signed by the new owner of the hotel's signature. He was the son of the old owner who hired Heather the same day as her graduation. The next letter was what she got when it was tucked into the door frame of her one-room apartment. A kitchen, a toilet, a shower, and a living space, all in the same space. It was an announcement from the landlord that rent was increasing 10%. The final letter was a job announcement for Naglfari, what she got from her mailbox. The Naglfari was the newest cruise ship built in Portishead. They were hiring experienced housekeeping staff, and they were offering nearly twice as much for the same work, plus they would pay for room and board. After everything else that happened that day, it seemed like a good idea to apply for work on the cruise ship, work there for the year, and save up for a better life. What Heather didn't realize going in was that what was coming with the double pay was triple work. In a hotel, you could step outside for a moment. You could leave after your shift was done. You could stop being a housekeeper for a few hours. Here on the cruise ship, you were working or you were in your shared quarters. Cruise quarters were kept below the waterline with small cabins with a roommate and a heavy door you had to be careful with. It opened slowly, but it was also built to keep water out if the ship was starting to sink. So getting a finger or an arm in would be disastrous. The Naglfari had a state-of-the-art casino, buffet, and even arcades, all of which were not to be used by staff while guests were on the ship. So even though Heather was making more money now than at any point in her life, and eating better since the cruise food was much better than what she was living off of in Portishead, it came at the high price of her work. Housekeeping had maybe 100 staff, and there were 6,000 guests on board. Even evenly dividing it, that meant up to 60 cabins per housekeeper. And just like hotel rooms on land, people were absolute slobs. Heather had already cleaned up cigarette ash from over a dozen rooms, despite the ship being a smoke-free ship. People left hairs in the bathroom sink, left enough crumbs on the ground to feed a starving country, left sheets and blankets on the ground. Sometimes much more disgusting things were left behind, all of which fell to housekeepers like Heather to clean. But despite the heavy work and the cleaning, some rooms were better kept than others. One of the rooms in her area had the courtesy to make both their beds and keep the trash in the trash bin, making it a much easier job. But the floors still needed to be vacuumed, the surfaces needed to be wiped down, and trash needed to be thrown. Even the cleanest guest took time to clean after, especially if it was to be done right. Heather was very familiar with cleaning hotels at land. At sea, it was much harder. Passengers were in their rooms for weeks at a time. A speck of saliva on a single surface could stick for hours if not scrubbed. Then it could hitch a ride on her outfit and be in every cabin before the day was over. So, Heather was certain to take pains to keep her cabin clean. And a perk of working at sea rather than on land is that guests usually tip housekeeping. In every room there was a small copper bowl marked for housekeeping that was in every cabin. They usually left a few pounds for cleaning the room, but not all passengers from Albion, and not everyone tipped in pounds. Quatchley and sesterces were very common. Colorful cotton bills, one with an eagle eating a snake on a cactus, and the other with an eagle clutching a sword. She wasn't sure what they were worth compared to pounds, but her roommate said it was worth a lot, so that was good. Other passengers, however, tipped in centi, which she did understand the conversion rate, but she always felt dirty touching the old copper coins. They always felt like they were soaked in blood, and the smell of old copper didn't help that visualization at all. But Heather needed the money, so she would take the coins, albeit reluctantly, doing her best to forget where it came from, and promising to exchange it for civilized currency as soon as she could. Other passengers left the strangest things in their tip bowls. The cabins with children usually left behind candy, gum, drawings, and once Heather even found a thank you card written in crayon left in the copper bowl. That note was now hanging next to her bed. Those weren't too bad. It was even kind of sweet that a child appreciated a clean room so much that they wanted to give some candy to the one cleaning it. One passenger, oddly enough, tipped her in pontoon chips, while his son left behind a drawing of dinosaurs. But it also wasn't uncommon for a tip bowl to be filled with nothing but dust, or worse, used as an ashtray. Heather had no doubts about what those passengers thought about housekeeping. Still lost in her thoughts as she finished up this cabin, she moved on to her last cabin of the day. One of the strangest she had seen in her 20 years of cleaning. It was immaculate as the day she left it before. The cabin was practically untouched. The bed was still made and tucked in. There were no clothes on the floor, no water in the bathroom, no trash in the wastebasket. The fridge had no fingerprints on the glass, and the curtains were still half drawn, showing the ocean outside. Despite herself, Heather paused to look out at the ocean. It was beautiful, the way it glittered from the sun, and even though it was a long way down, the ocean felt like it could hide anything. All the wonders, the treasures, the dangers, and the monsters of the world could be hiding just beneath the waves, ignorant of Heather, and her ignorant of them. This was another reason why she enjoyed working on the Naglfari. This was where the ocean could be beautiful. In Portishead, the ocean always looked gray. Here, she could watch the sun turn the blue into beautiful jewels. And she could see so much more of the world. Isle City, Kart Hadasht, Zama, and so many other beautiful cities. Sure, she'd have to work most of the time, but still, considering she never left Portishead before, but now she could see the world, that alone was an upgrade in her life. Heather was certain of that. After wiping down the bathroom, removing the old but unfolded towels, replacing with fresh towels, Heather moved on to sheets and blankets. Even though the blankets were unused, Naglfari prided itself on cleanliness and changed them daily. The new sheets on, the old ones in the cart. Then Heather began to spray the surfaces. Spray onto the rag and then rag to the dresser, wiping it down. The disinfectant did its job. Even though no dust, no dirt, and no dread divoted the dresser, the disinfectant demolished deadly diseases. Heather imagined how her cleanliness was the only thing keeping all the passengers safe and healthy. She heard many stories about how a simple mistake could crash a cruise. Those were drilled in by the training, but you rarely heard about how an exceptionally well done job prevented a disaster. People like Heather were expected to do their job and go. But it was all too easy to forget that an everyday, well-done job could prevent disasters. Clean plates kept a lethal allergic reaction from occurring. Proper pipes prevented cholera by bringing in blue water and removing gray water. Housekeeping kept rooms safe for people to be in. Lost in her thoughts of preventing a pandemic of pertussis, her eyes noticed the tip bowl before her mind caught up. Sitting in the copper bowl was a slip of paper. For your trouble. And the note was resting on a small pile of gold and coins. There were at least a dozen auras resting in the dish, possibly even more, each one with the seal of the Emperor of the Seven Cities. A single aura was worth as much as a month of working on the ship, and there was at least a year's worth of her salary just sitting in that copper bowl. Heather felt like she was going to throw up while looking at that gold. Being tipped in centi was one thing. She could tell herself they didn't know any better, or that they were just innocent civilians of a cruel empire. But a single oro was worth 2,000 centi. Anyone who was tipping this much wasn't someone innocent. They were someone who could have only gotten that much by doing something truly cruel. If centi were coated in blood, then oros were dripping in venom. Heather thought about the child soldiers, the immoral business practices, and the human experimentation, all thriving with the full approval of the Emperor of the Seven Cities. If this passenger had so much to spare, what was he doing? Would she be complicit in something just by touching those cursed coins? But another thought occurred to her. That money could come in handy. A year of saving every check and not spending a single penny would still not equal what was in that bowl. She could get herself into an even better position. She could have actual savings again. Open a bank account and not keep all of her money in a sock under her pillow. She could finally go back to school and maybe go from cleaning hotels to running them. The two conflicting clouds of thought raged in Heather's mind. After a minute of thinking it over, Heather made her decision. She reached down and picked up the rag she dropped on the dresser. It wasn't worth it in her mind. Even if there were 1,000,000 oros offered to her, knowing the poison that went into every single coin, that was something she could never carry. After picking up her rag, Heather noticed that there was a soft thumping inside the dresser, like something was trying to get out. Opening the drawer, expecting there to be a small personal electronic, or maybe a small animal, instead what she saw was a large, black plastic bag. It filled up the entire drawer with a lump in the middle that was moving around. The bag was sealed and opaque, with the only clue of what might be inside was white letters on the bag that spelled Mimir. M-I-M-I-R. A word that Heather was unfamiliar with. And a strange logo of a golden sun surrounded by 8 silver crescent moons, like the arrows of a compass rose. A logo that she was also unfamiliar with. Curious, but cautious, she reached her hand to touch the lump, to feel what it was. Maybe it was some kind of toy. Maybe Mimir was some kind of electronic store for the rich and powerful. Feeling the lump, even through the black plastic, it felt cold, and it moved in a way electronics didn't. There were definitely muscles flexing, and the slick, irritating sound of smooth plastic rubbing against hair. There was something alive in this plastic bag, and it was trying to get out. Heather remembered the procedure when dealing with potentially smuggled animals. They were to be taken down to the customs officer, who would say whether it was safe or dangerous for the animal to be on board. Typically, the customs officer had to be called for, but Heather didn't want the poor creature to suffocate in the bag. So, breaking procedure, she picked up the bag and put it in the cart with the laundry, as she tried to rip a hole into the plastic. Whatever type of plastic it was, it didn't stretch and it didn't want to break. The creature inside thrashed more and more the longer Heather tried to open the bag. Heather was worried that it was starting to suffocate. Finally getting her nail into the plastic, Heather felt the plastic give, and there was a pop as air rushed into the bag. Heather stuck her fingers into the new hole, trying to whiten it as she felt whatever was inside bite her. "Ow!" she said, removing her fingers, seeing that crimson was leaking from her index finger.
Whatever was in that bag tore a chunk of her skin clean off, and she was going to have to get it treated. Wrapping her hand in a clean cotton rag, Heather pushed the cart with the creature in the bag and some clothes lightly over it, so that no one would see it struggling around. It took Heather less than 5 minutes to push the cart to the service elevator and ride it down to the customs officer's office. Unlike the elevators reserved for guests, which were mostly glass and were featured prominently where it could be seen everywhere, the service elevators were entirely cold steel and hidden in the employees-only areas. They were built to lift up to 10 metric tons, and they were very large, even bigger than the room Heather slept in. The customs office was a small room down a narrow hall, ran by the officer known by everyone as Carl the Jarl, a play on words about how he treated his office, like his own little domain. The cages behind him were empty. The filing cabinets were closed and neat. Even the trash in the wastebasket was folded and put away. Carl was a white, very large man, nearly 7 feet tall, with a large scar dominating the left part of his head. The right side of his head had long red hair that he kept down to almost his shoulder. Rumor was on the ship that he had a metal plate put into his head as a result of a war injury, and that was why he was half bald. His desk, unlike his office, was chaos incarnate. Papers, sticky notes, pens, coffee mugs, and clipboards covered every square inch of the desk that didn't hold his small laptop. He bounced from one document to the other in no order that Heather could see, and he did it with incredible enthusiasm, like he was a starving man at a feast. Heather stood there for a moment before she spoke up. "Hello, sir? I think there is an animal in one of the rooms. I think we should do something about it." Carl, without looking up from his work, picked up a single clipboard with a pen attached by a pen and string. "Fill out this form and leave the creature in a cage for me to examine," Carl said in a bored voice. "You don't want to just check it out now?" Heather asked him. Carl finally paused and looked up at her, like she just asked him to kill his firstborn child. "There's paperwork that needs to be filled out," Carl the Jarl said, like that answered anything. Sighing to herself, Heather began to fill out the customs animal and fruit form. At least the bite didn't affect her writing hand. The form was similar to an incident form. Where did it happen? Was a passenger involved? Can she identify the animal? Did the animal harm her or another passenger? And did it cause damage to any property? After filling out the form to the best of her ability, she handed it back to Carl, who glanced over the form and asked Heather, "Can I see her bite?" Heather removed the cotton rag and showed her left hand to the customs officer. The wound was clotted over, and it didn't hurt anymore. But oddly enough, where the veins that were visible, they were looking more green than their normal blue. Carl, seeing the wound, immediately started writing on a small pad. "Okay, you're going to the clinic, and you're getting that cleaned out, and you're getting some antibiotics. You said you got bit 10 minutes ago?" "More or less, yeah." "Whatever that animal is, it's very sick. Infection's already setting in, and it's going to get septic unless you get some antibiotics on it now, or else." Carl's statement hung in the air for a moment before he continued. "This note will get you out of work for the rest of the trip. Go see the doctor. You definitely need his help. If he tries to drag his feet, give him this note," Carl said, handing her a second note. "Go, hurry," Carl said before turning back to his paperwork. Heather, not sure what else to do, turned around and walked down the hallway, leaving the cart and the creature inside. Despite no longer pushing the cart, when she made it back to the service elevator, She was already panting, like she just ran a marathon. Standing at the elevator button, she pressed the call button, leaving behind a streak of blood on the button as it lit up. Didn't she have it covered with a rag? Looking back down the hallway, Heather saw the blood-soaked rag sitting on the floor, along with a trail of delicious-looking blood droplets leading to where she stood. So she removed a rubber glove from her apron to cover her bleeding hand. Before she put the glove on her hand, she looked over her wound. The green veins were spreading, making her hand look like it belonged to a green spider web. The scab where it was bitten was peeled away, and so was much of her skin on her index finger. But she didn't feel any pain or anything really in her hand. The blood leaking from her index finger had the look and consistency of barbecue sauce. It even smelled sweet to her. It oozed out slowly, and Heather was transfixed. Deciding it wouldn't hurt, she brought it to her mouth, and she tasted the thick sauce of her own blood. The taste was indeed sweet, but also savory. That little bit awoke a hunger deep within herself. It was like her stomach had grown a mouth of its own, and it was trying to tear its way out of her. The hunger continued to spread from her stomach, filling her entire body like a cold fire, freezing every nerve it came across and leaving only numbness and hunger inside. But still, the part of her mind that was still Heather slid the glove over her ruined hand, and she pushed the button for the top floor. She had to get to the infirmary. She was sick. She needed help. She needed hunger. The doors shut, and so did Heather's eyes. When they both opened again, what was behind them was no longer Heather. Taking steps out of the service elevator, the creature stalked, searching for its prey. The noise brought it forward, resting its hand on a wall, waiting for input to make a motion. Just behind it, a man with a child by his side and one on his back approached her. They were close enough that if they spoke, the creature would have struck and snacked on them. But instead, the man took a different path at the behest of his daughter. The creature continued to stand there, until it saw a door open and someone leave the room. The creature stalked forward. Still freshly turned, it moved very quickly. It still moved silently. The person leaving their room didn't have time to scream before the creature that used to be Heather was on top of them, its teeth tearing through their throats and their savory blood soaking the housekeeper's outfit. This blood wasn't sweet. It was only coppery and salty, but the creature enjoyed the taste of the blood on its hands far more than Heather ever did. And already, as the body's heartbeat under the creature's hand was stopped, the body began to turn cold, and it began to move. The meal was gone, and now there was another of its kind. Both creatures wandered away from each other, both trailing brown viscous blood as they sought to do the most basic of bacterial tasks: consume and multiply. Kaisa was leading the children in a sing-along when the announcement rang across the ship. Keeping the sing-along going, Kaisa tried to use the universal expression of, "What the hell does that mean?" to their manager, Godfrey, a short man wearing all red and with a large belly and a very long white beard. Unfortunately for Kaisa, the Godfrey responded with the universal expression of, How should I know? I only work here. Kaiser responded with a stare, as deadly as they could manage, while also singing songs about dying of disease and burning the bodies, while the children sang along and ran around, careful not to touch each other. Hide away, keep 6 feet away. Hide away, she brought us down today. The children chanted, while Kaiser managed to wade through the sea of children to make it to their boss. How is quarantine supposed to work? They asked Godfrey, who only shrugged again. He was reading through a booklet of procedures before he finally made it to the section that addressed the kids' zone. The Naglfari was one of the best cruise ships of its generation, so naturally it had a kids' zone, a walled-off section of the ship filled with play structures, a splash pool, wide open area for playing, even an arcade and a kitchen. The kids' zone was sealed off from the rest of the ship via a set of waterproof glass doors. Kaiser was unsure of the exact specifications of the doors, but they were supposed to keep the kids' zone safe from an explosive flood of water in case the ship started sinking. It even had curtains on the inside, so when it was closed, lights could be kept inside. Okay, so per quarantine procedure, the staff at the kids' zone are expected to stay with the children until the parents come to pick them up. Then the staff are to head to their quarters to await further instructions. Godfrey read, before lifting his eyes up from the manual to see Kaiser's red face. I don't suppose it mentioned what to do if the parents don't show up, does it? They asked. Most of the parents of this trip were good at picking up their kids at the end of closing, but there were 2 children, Adriana and Michael, who had parents that waited until well after closing to pick up their children. At one point, Michael was there well past midnight with Kaiser, waiting for his father to show up. He showed up drunk and stumbling, not even self-aware enough to apologize, while his half-asleep son guided them back to the cabin. Kaiser remembered that day well because Godfrey went back to his cabin at 6 p.m., and he refused to start an investigation for neglect. He stated that parents sometimes showed up late. It didn't mean anything was happening. The fact that Kaiser had to be back at work at 7 a.m. and wasn't able to sleep until the witching hour didn't mean anything to their boss. No, the manual just says to stay with them until their parents come to pick them up. I swear, Godfrey, if I'm stuck here past midnight, alone, again, you know I'm going to quit. Relax, that's not going to happen this time. What makes you say that? Well, if you quit, then I'll just toss you overboard, Godfrey joked. So Kaiser responded by sighing. I'm serious. I don't want to be here past midnight again. Once was enough, and I didn't even get overtime for that, Kaiser explained. Well, tell you what, if Michael's dad doesn't come back here, I'll stay with you the whole time, even if it takes all night, Godfrey promised. I'll hold you to it, Kaiser said before they plastered on their customer service smile when the first round of concerned parents arrived, while they have the forms for the parents to sign to get to their children. Working with children had a lot of challenges, but one of the biggest people forget about is the paperwork. Every activity had to be written down and approved a week ahead of time. Forms for injuries, forms for signing in, forms for signing out. And that was before anything complicated like medication, allergies, accommodations, injuries, or special requests. Good gods, the special request forms were always extensive. Kaiser had to read through each and every one, and usually it was for something simple like a fear of clowns or an allergy they couldn't easily list earlier. But other times the requests were something truly trying, such as getting the children into the captain's quarters, or getting them to dive into the ocean while the ship was still moving. One strange parent had a 15-page request that could be summed up as, "Teach my child to make cheese." But the forms had to be filled out, or as far as the corporate powers that be were concerned, it never happened. A forgotten play plan or a child being signed out without being signed in were considered greater misgivings than all the 7 deadly sins combined. And parents were already impatient without quarantine announced. The quarantine only made them even more impatient. Why do I even need to sign out my child? You saw me here earlier today. One parent with pink hair and carrying a stuffed shrimp asked Kaisa. Only the 8th person to ask Kaisa that very same question, while they had to have the corporate-approved answer. We just want to be safe rather than sorry, Kaisa said with a reassuring smile while they bit back the real reason. There were over 200 children visiting the kids zone every day, most of which were dropped off by parents who spent less than a minute that entire trip speaking to Kaisa. They could barely remember what they had for breakfast, let alone the face of a bored parent who couldn't even say 3 words to Kaisa. Especially when there's over 400 parents who all did the exact same thing. But Kaisa knew it would be a hopeless cause explaining that to the parents, who assumed that the center of their universes was also the center of everyone else's universe. So Kaisa focused on their job, checking out children one at a time, and on the odd quiet moment they had to go back to their children who remained. After all, it wasn't like Godfrey was going to do anything about that. Making sure that the children were all still alright, and more importantly, that they were all having fun. There were 40 children in the kids zone when quarantine was announced. In 2 minutes, there were only 30. Then there were 25. Then 18, 15, 13, 9, 4, then finally 2. 30 minutes after quarantine was announced, the only children left were Michael and Adriana. Michael was off in the painting corner, just painting what he imagined Primeval looked like. Vast grasslands and tons of dinosaurs. Other children were nervous, or at least aware of the quarantine announcement. Michael was painting when the announcement was made, and he was still painting, just like every other day in the kids zone. Adriana was a different story. She had a rag doll in her arm that kept her company. She loved playing the games in the arcade, but usually couldn't get into the games she wanted because they were always crowded with other children. But now she was having the time of her life when there was no one else to bother her. I'm getting worried. Their parents still aren't here. Are we going to quarantine them with us? Kaisa asked their boss, who was still flipping through the manual, trying to find some information he missed before. Even though it had been over 30 minutes at this point and no new information was found, he was still looking for something new. Anything new. No. Yes. I don't know. What do you expect me? You expect me to know something? This is my first cruise. You're my boss. I thought you'd know something I don't know. Isn't there some kind of secret manager manual or training that I wasn't allowed to go to that you went to? Kaisa asked Godfrey, who only stared back at them. No, we aren't given a secret manual. Everyone on the ship is given the same manual. Only difference between me and you is I have the key, and I get asked all the questions from above. Don't you make more than me? Trust me, that difference is smaller than you think. My job isn't to have all the answers just because I'm in charge. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go speak to the captain. He must know what to do since he's in charge, Godfrey said without the smallest hint of irony and without any connection between the separate thoughts. Uh-huh. So in other words, you're leaving me alone with the kids while you head to your room, Kaisa pointed out. No, I'm not going back to my room. I'm getting help so we know what to do. I won't be gone for long. Uh-huh. You know I'm going to keep my word. Sure. Don't talk like that. talk? Like what? Like you don't believe me. What makes you think I don't believe you? Kaisa asked, their arms crossed and a foot tapping. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew that Godfrey already established himself as someone who didn't follow through. And now he was in a situation where he had to prove he was being honest. After a moment, he reached into his shirt and pulled out a lanyard that had a large key on it. The key to the front doors of the Kid Zone. Without it, he couldn't lock up the Kid Zone, nor unlock it to let himself in. Here, take this. If their parents come back before I do, then you can lock up and go to your cabin. But now, you know I'll keep my word. I can't go back to my room without my key, Godfrey told Kaisa. Kaisa knew this was true. The manager was supposed to have the key at all times. Without having the key, if Godfrey's boss found out, Godfrey could be written up or even fired. You going to be okay? Kaisa asked, their fingers dangling near the key that Godfrey was offering. Yeah, I'm sure. Like I said, I won't be gone long. I just want to check with the captain, Godfrey answered. Kaisa thought about it for a moment longer before taking the key and putting the lanyard in their pocket. Godfrey nodded before walking out the front door from the Kid Zone to the main deck. Outside of the Kid Zone, Kaisa could see that the lights were mostly off. Somewhere between a half and 1/3 of the lights were still on. But for the most part, the deck was dark and quiet. Cruise ships were normally busy places. Even at night, there were people running by, or people chatting and drinking, or at least staff moving things along, getting work done at night they couldn't get done during the day. Laughter and life flourished, even during the witching hour. Here, during the quarantine, it was like something from a horror movie. Something caused everyone to hide away, and Kaisa couldn't help but feel like they had to hide also. So, locking the glass door behind Godfrey, they headed back to the children. Sure enough, Adriana was still playing pachinko by herself, trying to win herself a horse toy. Michael was still quiet and moved on to a new canvas, leaving his old one to dry in its easel. The children safe, Kaisa decided now was a great time to focus on their paperwork. Finally getting a chance to catch up while the children and Godfrey were gone. Kaisa wasn't sure how long they were working on paperwork, but they realized it must have been a long time when they were fully caught up with everything, and no one knocked at the door, and both Adriana and Michael were still playing alone. Checking their watch, Kaisa saw that it had been 2 hours since quarantine had been declared, and still Adriana and Michael's parents hadn't arrived. Godfrey was also still out. No way it took him 2 hours to find the captain. He definitely left Kaisa to deal with the children. Alone. Again. Sighing to themselves, they went to the door to see if they were missing something. Sometimes hints could be seen if you got closer to the problem. At first, it looked like Michael left brown paint on the glass. But then as Kaisa got closer, they realized that the paint was on the other side of the glass. Long streaks and brown handprints were left along the glass, looking like a surrealist painting about starvation. At least until Kaisa got closer and stopped in their tracks. Outside the Kid Zone were dozens of dark eyes. Numerous people were crowding against the glass. Hands and even faces were pressed against it. Their bodies left viscous blood from their wounds against the glass. The ones that still had their eyes just looked so wrong. They didn't reflect light correctly. Their eyes were glazed over and covered in a thin film that was the same color as their wounds. But their eyes, unfocused as they were, followed Kaisa, following them as they got closer. and behind the ones pressed against the glass, Kaisa could see that others were coming, and they were all fighting to get closer to the glass. Glass built to withstand the full force of the ocean, more than strong enough to keep them out indefinitely. At least, that's what Kaisa hoped was true. Seeing their eyes and the way they moved like a perpetual video game glitch, jerking and twitching into position and trying to break through, looking at them, Kaisa could feel a primal fear drip down their spine. Something about what was outside made every single cell in their body scream danger. It pushed them to hide from what was out there, even if there was no way they could get in. Turning around to look at the children, Kaisa could see they were still distracted, but if they came to the front, they could see very clearly that their parents weren't there to pick them up. That something was much, much worse. And it was just outside, trying to get in. What could they do? Kaisa's mind racing, their eyes fell on the curtain. Large curtains that could cover the entire glass and keep the abominations from outside from looking in. And could keep Kaisa, or the kids, from looking outside. Grabbing the rod, Kaisa moved the curtain across the glass. Despite not being able to smell or hear the creatures outside, they shivered. Something deep inside them knew that they smelled rotten, and that they moaned like the wind in an empty valley. Something that caused Kaisa to shudder and shiver despite the warmth of the kid zone. The curtain now fully covering the glass, Kaisa turned off the front lights and returned to Adriana and Michael. Remembering the captain's word that the Vanguard would be arriving soon meant that help was on the way, or at least it had to be on the way. You'd have to cut through the creatures, but that still meant help was going to get there. Okay, so I just got word. We're going to have a sleepover tonight. Kaisa improvised, not sure what else could be said. Adriana stopped playing pachinko with her horse in one arm and her ragdoll in the other arm. She was very clearly excited, probably realizing this meant she could win more horses. Michael looked up for a moment before going back to his painting. He was only bored, but still, at least no one was going to try to go out the front. Okay, so I'm going to go get snacks. You two keep back here, Kaisa said as they walked to the small kitchen. Their hands were shaking when they went through. When they closed the door to the kitchen, a loud sob escaped their throat. There were monsters outside, and the children were in danger, even if they didn't know it. Taking a deep breath, Kaisa did their best to project calmness. They glanced at themselves at a mirror in the kitchen. Seeing terror, they closed their eyes and took a deep breath. Opening their eyes, they couldn't see the terror anymore. It was okay to feel the fear, but the important part wasn't to panic. There would be time to panic after the danger has passed. If they panicked now, they would never get a chance to see what was after the danger. A feeling of control, if not calm, settled over Kaisa, and their hands stopped shaking. It's just a sleepover. Get the kids away from the glass, turn the lights off, and make sure they have snacks. There should be enough snacks for a few weeks. Children eat a lot, and typically there are enough snacks to last a few days for 200 children. That translated to more than enough for 2 children to eat, or 2 children and 1 adult. So Kaisa grabbed 4 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches from the fridge, before pausing for a moment and grabbing 2 more sandwiches for themselves. They also didn't eat all day, and they were just starting to feel hungry, so it made sense to grab some food also. It was really easy to forget about food unless you were holding it. Carrying the armfuls of sandwiches to the main floor, Kaisa saw that the kids were still doing their thing. So they called out. Like I said, I was given word. We're going to have a sleepover here in the kids' zone until the quarantine is over and the Vanguard comes to get us. One lie, one truth, and one hopeful statement. All of which Kaisa hoped that the children couldn't tell what was what. They turned to face Kaisa with big eyes. Their mouths dropped open and they ran over to Kaisa with their arms outstretched. Kaisa's breath caught in their throat until they felt the children's arms wrap around their legs in the tight hugs kids do when they wanted to be close. Food! They yelled in unison, and Kaisa let out a chuckle. Turns out the kids were hungry too. And thankfully they weren't hungry for flesh. Just for some nice, safe sandwiches. Dragging their legs, and the kids, forward to the large play area, Kaisa took out the picnic basket and laid it on the floor. It was only taken out on special occasions, but Kaisa figured this counted. Okay, so I have 2 sandwiches for each of us. If you need more, let me know, Kaisa began, before both Michael and Adriana tore a sandwich each out of Kaisa's arms. Already ripping the plastic off and tearing into the cheap sandwiches like it was ambrosia of the gods. You're welcome, Kaisa said in a tone indicating that this was a learning opportunity. Thank you, Kaisa, they both said in unison, and Kaisa smiled before opening their own sandwich and eating into it. They were never too much of a fan of peanut butter and jelly. It was usually too sweet for their taste. But tonight it truly felt like a blessing just to have some food in a safe sanctuary. Kaisa ate quietly while Adriana talked about the game she played, and Michael listened politely. By the time the next rounds of sandwiches were open, everyone was eating more calmly, and Michael was talking about the dinosaurs he was painting. He would tell Adriana and Kaisa about different climates on Primeval and how it would affect adaptation. Both children could not fully understand why the other enjoyed what they enjoyed so much, but they were just enjoying the fact that it brought happiness. Something that always brought a smile to Kaisa's face. At least until they remembered what was waiting in the front of the kids' zone. Then their smile was then gone. And their hands started shaking again. Taking a deep breath, Kaisa asked, "Why don't you two start building a blanket and pillow fort in the play area? I'm going to go get a movie." This brought a spring into the children's step as they both ran off to collect the pillows and blankets. Naturally, there were quite a few in the kids' zone. Some children were young enough to need naps. Kaisa walked to the front, their hands still shaking as they approached the curtain. They couldn't hear anything behind the glass, but that didn't mean anything. They didn't hear anything earlier, but that didn't really mean nothing, when earlier no sound was heard also. Only a few feet away from the curtains, Kaisa felt their hands shake so much it was like they were shivering. Here they were. The truth of what was happening out there was close enough for them to see for themselves. All they had to do was move the curtain enough to peek through. But Kaisa could feel the fear overwhelm their heart. In their mind they saw a nightmare horde coating the entire ship. An ocean's worth of undead pressing against the glass and mere seconds away from shattering it. You could turn back, Kaisa told himself. It would be real easy. Turn around, grab the case with the movie. The unknown would stay unknown, and ignorance would be bliss. Wouldn't it? Except it wouldn't be bliss, they reminded themselves. They knew the undead was out there. And if they didn't look behind the curtain, then it didn't matter how bad it was. Their imagination would make it worse, and panic would be a lot harder to fight. That knowledge made the choice for Kaiser. Even if it was as bad as their imagination, it was better to be aware of it than to be ignorant and fearful. Taking a deep breath, they stepped forward and moved the curtain aside a single inch so their left eye could peer out. At first, fear kept their eyes tense and closed, but after a moment they gradually relaxed, opening their eyes to look out into the weak light of the main deck outside. And what they saw was nothing. Well, not truly nothing. There was brown blood scabbing on the glass, and a few figures were seen wandering around the deck in the distance, but no undead were pressed into the glass. No one and nothing was trying to get into the kid zone. The dead were attracted to the light, but with the curtains closed and the lights turned off, they couldn't care less about the kid zone. Kaiser was safe. The kids were safe. They were going to be okay until the vanguard arrived. Letting out a breath they didn't know they were holding, Kaiser let go of the curtain and looked at their hands. Their hands were no longer shaking, and they were finally able to relax. The kids were safe, and they were all going to stay safe, and Kaiser knew it would stay that way. Turning away from the outside world, they turned back to the desk and made their movie selections. They would have the entire night to watch all the movies, but Kaiser was comfortable with that. Now they knew it wasn't as bad as they feared. They figured there was now room to let things be better than they could hope for. Dr. M. Faustus was already bored of waiting in the VIP line. This line was for the VIPs, the very important persons, the very best of the best. Why was there a line at all? It should have been him and no one else. All the peasants below were in a much longer line. Bags, suitcases, and luggage were all being checked down on the peasants' line. The VIP line was civilized enough not to check bags. Just check a passport and let them go through. Still, the good doctor was happy no one was going to be searching his bag, and no one was going to see Mimir. Getting closer to the front of the line, Dr. Faustus reminisced about where he obtained Mimir. The good doctor was doing what he did best, making deals, and there were people in the 7 cities who considered themselves powerful. Powerful enough to seek out the good Dr. Faustus, and to do something most people couldn't ever dream of doing. Actually offer something that Faustus wanted. So, with that deal, Faustus was in Bristol, Albion. There were rumors of a delightful little outbreak that the local Hunters Guild and the Order of Steel were struggling to put down. So, the good doctor took the first plane he could to Bristol. Sure enough, it was in celebratory chaos. Most of the buildings were burnt out, the remaining populace hid in the church or the constable, soldiers on the street, the dead refusing to lay down, and every day the local leaders were worried the infection would break through the barricades. An absolutely perfect place for the good doctor to do his work and have a vacation. If only that damn Order of Steel and the Hunters Guild weren't so good at doing their jobs. The Order of the Shield was treating those bitten, and the Hunters Guild were killing the host too quickly. The outbreak was causing delightful damage, but the Baron's Bacillus, the bacteria that caused Sandy syndrome, couldn't live very long without a living host, which led to an even greater problem. Those living hosts suffering from Sandy syndrome were even less cooperative than Typicam peasants. So, by the time Faustus arrived in Bristol, there were very few left suffering that he could reach. At least until he made it to the edge of town. There, at the edge of town, was a young man trying to escape. a conspiratorial and paranoid man who was convinced at first that the infection was fake. Then when he was infected, he became convinced that the soldiers weren't there to help him. So he tried to escape Bristol and get away from the soldiers carrying the bite on his own arm. He even managed to get past the patrol routes, but he didn't even make it half a mile past the edge before he collapsed from battling the bacteria. As delightful a distraction as it was, Dr. Faustus knew he couldn't leave the boy alone. Either he would escape and create further outbreaks, which, while entertaining, wouldn't help the plans of Faustus, or the boy would be captured and killed by the soldiers, which would be even less entertaining and be even less helpful. So, Faustus approached the collapsed corpse from the woods, ready to do his job. But, getting close, the body lifted its hand to the good doctor. A tiny bit of light remained in the boy's empty eyes. His voice also whispered, "Help me," he cried in a pathetic voice that screamed with its near silence. The boy acted out of sheer self-interest, and when he experienced consequences for his choices, he ran away, making the problem worse for everyone else, and quite possibly a threat to the entire world. Ah, a man after the good doctor's own heart. The doctor's heart cried out for the man as he decided to help the pathetic pup. Two quick cuts between some vertebrae and a strong pull, and Dr. Faustus was able to lift the severed head into the air by its hair. The last of its life, its blood, and its humanity spilled out when it was lifted up, all making the head much easier to carry for Dr. Faustus. Placing the head into a plastic bag, sealing it and drawing out most of its air, Dr. Faustus marked it with the name Mimir, named after the Norse god that was nothing more than a severed head, but whom still played a vital role in Ragnarok, the end of the world. Buyers for the head had a thing for poetic symbolism, and even provided multiple bags which they wanted to be named Mimir, with the severed head inside. They even arranged for transport from Albion to the Seven Cities via a new cruise ship named Naglfari, the same name as a ship built out of dead man's nails that would set sail during Ragnarok, carrying a legion of undead warriors, giants, and monsters who would do battle with the gods and bring about the end of the world. As much as Dr. Faustus wasn't a fan of drama, he did admire the poetry of him holding a potential end to the world on a ship that was supposed to bring to the end of the world, all on its maiden voyage. There was an interruption from his memory when Faustus was about to snap, until he realized the interruption was because he was at the front of the VIP line. "Ticket, please," the board guard asked. So Faustus brought out his best glittering smile while he removed the envelope from his jacket. The ticket was inside the envelope along with a single glittering golden aura. Faustus found in this modern era tipping was considered standard, and he found that tipping in auras was best. The money it was worth meant very little to him when his banks were bursting enough that the interest earned in a single day was worth more than some families made in an entire year. Still, though, it had a habit of making him appear to be a more trustworthy man. Very few people questioned someone who was kind enough to tip so well and so easily. And sure enough, this guard was also easy to fool. The guard brightened up, and he waved Dr. Faustus and his single briefcase through without even the most cursory of checks. And the good doctor was more than happy to oblige, carrying his briefcase and his guest up to his cabin. A lovely cabin that had a fantastic view of the ocean. A cabin that Faustus intended on seeing as little of as possible. Removing Mimir from his suitcase and leaving it in the drawer, hopefully for some lost soul to find, and his suitcase in the closet so that no one would find it, he could now spend the next 3 days enjoying the many amenities of the ship. The food was delicious, the ocean beautiful, and the staff were all so professional and kind. And Dr. Faustus found that all just so terribly boring. The ship was supposed to be fun, and it was like it was designed by some lovesick librarian. There was a casino, which did give Dr. Faustus something to do, but everyone was only betting money. And most of the people never bothered to bet more than a few thousand centi. Dr. Faustus missed the real gambling of places like Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage. The poor betting their literal arms and legs just for an opportunity to win a bit of wonder into their bleak lives. The wealthy would lay down entire kingdoms worth of gold, land, titles, and assets to try and fill that void in their lives that they made, only to find that they themselves still had the void and couldn't even have a shirt to try and hide from it anymore. Now that was real gambling. Watching the truly desperate believe that things couldn't get any worse, only to watch to see how much worse it can get. Still, the casino had a few interesting people. Timothy Gavin was a professional pontoon player who often played Dr. Faustus, only to forget him the next time they saw each other. At first, Dr. Faustus was worried there was something wrong with the gambler, but then he realized it was just the way he forgot anything not relevant to him. Still though, on the third day, Dr. Faustus was quite certain he made an impression on the young Timothy Gavin. When there was an announcement that an outbreak of bacterial meningitis occurred on the ship, a wide smile broke across the good doctor's face. The housekeeper finally found Mimir. Now time for the next request of Dr. Faustus's buyer. Proof that Sandy syndrome was just as deadly as warned. A few auras to the dealer, and Dr. Faustus knew he had both the dealer and Timothy Galvin out, just for a little longer. A few more variables for the test to remain out. After losing a few rounds on purpose, Dr. Faustus was confident it had been long enough, leaving his chips and auras at the table. After all, what were they worth when it was nothing compared to what he was about to earn? He left and traveled down the dark halls. Leaving the casino, he saw that many of the lights were off. Some kind of procedure from the corporate office about keeping lights down during disasters. Still, it was quiet, dark, ominous, and absolutely boring. Dr. Faustus was expecting pandemonium, death crawling through every single door, and screams that could be heard across the ship. So far, it was just slow silence. Sighing to himself, the good doctor strode down the dark hallway. Who knows, maybe there was some more going on elsewhere. Stalking through the hallway, the most Dr. Faustus heard at first was the muffled noise of televisions and families safely in their cabins. Absolutely the worst kind of people. What kind of people would spend time with their family in safety and quiet? The kind of people that Faustus never bothered to deal with. They would never take a risk, even if there was a good reward. What he was looking for was people who would think of quarantine as a chance to party. People who would see opportunity in danger. Those who would see fear as only a new rush, chasing greater and greater dangers like an addict seeking greater and greater highs, growing more resistant to the joy, but more and more vulnerable to the damage. In the experience of the good doctor, people like that always existed in every group. And they always felt like not only were they better than everyone else, they were also the loudest and the rowdiest. And sure enough, on the main deck, Dr. Faustus saw a large collection of patrons. They were passing drinks to each other. Most were in the water, but a few were dancing on the edge of the pool. No staff in sight, not even security, not even a lifeguard. They were very loud, and it was only a matter of time before they attracted the attention of someone or something. So, in anticipation, Dr. M. Faustus leaned on the rail looking down at them, smoking a cigar that he kept in his jacket while he watched them play their games below. As Dr. Faustus watched the party below, he finally saw something start to approach. On the other end of the main deck, something lurched forward. Dressed like a security guard, at first glance, someone could easily mistake it for a normal security guard on any cruise ship. Except, even the most tired security guard didn't move this way. They don't lurch forward like a puppet with half of its strings cut. They didn't glare with the intensity of the void, and they didn't moan with all the terror of the abyss. And most security guards didn't have a brown splash of blood on their shoulder where they were bitten, and they definitely didn't carry fresh red blood around their mouth where they had bitten someone else. Sandy syndrome was simply splendid to see. Despite the creature's moaning, no one saw it as it approached slowly. Despite its jerky movements, a lot of human eyes were trained to ignore slow-moving things. Their eyes were more easily attracted to quick and sudden movements, such as the women dancing drunkenly to the music. The creature moaned instinctively, a way to attract others of its kind to its location. Yet the partygoers didn't hear it over the music. But Dr. Faustus heard the moan echo, and heard others echo the moan. Help was on its way. Taking his cell phone out of his pocket, Dr. Faustus pressed the record button just as the security officer stalked to its simple sacrifice. A short man dressed in red and with a long white beard, laughing while he was drinking. Security grabbed the man by the shoulder, who didn't even have the frame of mind to react, before the creature struck, biting into his neck and tearing much of his throat and a lot of his blood out at the same time. The man in red was now coated in red, while he laid on the ground screaming, and the creature continued its stalking forward. A lot of people assumed that the undead functioned like predators, stalking, hunting, eating, and killing. For some undead, this was true, but those suffering from Sandy syndrome had a far more basic bacterial business: consume and spread. They had little need for food or anything else. They sought to spread the bacteria that gave them life. They did this through two primary means of spreading infection. The first was a bite. A single bite could spread the bacteria, and when the infected sensed that their prey was infected, they would move on. Oh, sometimes they would feed for a while, but they didn't like cold bodies, and they didn't enjoy the smell of infection. They would often seek out the brightest, the loudest, or the best-smelling prey they could find. The man in red was already starting to turn. Security only took a few steps forward, but with the man already dying, the bacteria had an easier time turning him. No pesky immune system to slow it down, and easy access to the brain. In less than a minute, he would be turned and joining security in the stalking of his sweet sacrificial lambs. Some who would be bitten somewhere farther from the head would last longer. They may even have a chance for treatment if caught early enough, but isolated, ignorant, and injured very few who were bitten would ever receive treatment. The partygoers were still going. No one noticed that one of their own was bitten, nor did they notice the other crashers crawling closer and closer. As the security officer approached the main clump of people, Dr. Faustus saw that he was going to see the other way that Sandy syndrome was primarily spread. The security officer began to gag as it approached the main group of people. Already, someone tried approaching him to ask if he was all right. They were either too drunk to notice the blood on its face, or, more likely, they thought he just injured himself. Still, though, they only fell for the trap of the undead. Well, maybe not trap. A trap implied it was an action that was planned and thought out. Instead, what happened was an instinctive action done by those with Sandy syndrome when they saw multiple warm bodies nearby they could infect. The security officer regurgitated blood, bile, and brains all over the main group of people. Already there were screams, and the other undead approaching began to tear into the stragglers, who avoided being puked on. Sandy syndrome thrived in the stomach along with the brain and saliva. The undead could use parts of their meals as a concentrated cocktail of corrupted contagion. The venom spewed out would spread infection just as effectively as a bite, except among many others at the same time. It was definitely disgusting, but it was extraordinarily effective. The entire party group now infected in some way, Dr. Faustus grew bored and he stopped his recording. There was no point in remaining. Some of the partygoers were already turned and now hunting others. But those who were infected but didn't know it yet were being ignored by the undead and trying to wash off the bile. Like that could honestly do anything. Still, the good doctor had enough for evidence for his video. A single bite from a single victim was spreading, and the spread would only grow greater. How long until the dam sought out those who sought to hide? How long until the vanguard arrived, exposing themselves? Who knows, maybe the ship would be able to make it to port in Isle City. Then an entire city of 10 million SAMD syndrome sufferers would stalk single-mindedly throughout the 7 cities. That thought brought a strong smile to the doctor's face. That kind of chaos would make Bristol look like a case of the sniffles. And at least Albion had a functional order of steel and Hunters Guild. Isle City had the Coastal Guardians. That dynamic duo, while definitely good, also definitely couldn't delay a division of the damned dead. So, this was turning out even better than Dr. Faustus could believe. A spring was in his step now as he traveled to his room to grab his things. He had 2 more things to do on the ship before he left. Very important things for his buyers. That he had to do these things, otherwise he wouldn't get his full payment. And the only people in his experience who cared about the devil and the details more than the devil himself were those who made deals with the devil. Grabbing his suitcase from the closet, Dr. Faustus went to his drawer, but he paused when he saw the pile of auras were still waiting in the tip bowl. Very odd that housekeeping didn't take his more than generous tip. In all of his travels, he never knew anyone who would refuse so much gold. Even if the gold was gorged with gore and sealed with sins, they would accept the gold with all the gleeful gluttony of Mammon. Maybe the housekeeper was someone who died before they could accept the gold, the good doctor finally decided. The thought that someone would willingly refuse the gold never occurred to him. Honorable humans were about as likely as sinful saints, in his opinion. But when he opened the drawer, he found it empty. Seeing it empty, he slammed it shut while he swore. Alta V, you were supposed to take the gold and leave the head, not take the head and leave the gold. That just makes things harder for me, he muttered before he sighed and opened his suitcase, removing something else from his minimal luggage. A sharp steel scalpel, strong enough to slice through a skull. He now had 3 things to take care of, and like any good doctor, he kept his tools close. Fortunately, it was quite easy to find a new Mimir. Traveling along the top deck, heading towards the captain's quarters, it wasn't long until Dr. Faustus found a sufferer. It used to be a tall man, but now it was hunched, and it hissed when it saw Faustus. Even this broken being knew that there was something very inhuman with the good doctor. Holding his scalpel in hand, Dr. Faustus approached the SAMD syndrome sufferer. Easy prey for you, big guy. All you gotta do is take it, he said as he approached the creature. Finally, the creature let out a long moan. And reached out its hands as it lunged towards Faustus. The creature easily had a foot on the good doctor, and maybe an extra 100 pounds. Whatever he was in life, he was still fast and strong even in death. He would have easily overpowered any normal man. Dr. Mephistopheles Faustus was anything but a normal man. Grabbing the creature's arm in one hand, he easily broke it so it was non-functional and slid its scalpel completely around its neck. 2 quick cuts and the creature's head dangled behind its back. It gurgled as it hung upside down, looking at Dr. Faustus, and turned back to face the creature. The largest smile he had in his entire life was on his face, while he severed the spinal column with his scalpel. 2 more quick cuts and the head fell, and the body soon followed. Picking up the head, Faustus examined it. It snarled and bit in this state, but did so in near silence. It had no lungs to make any noise. It existed as a strong bioweapon, but one easily controlled. The slight smell of rot from its necrosis tantalized Dr. Faustus's nostrils. Smells like home, he said while he removed another opaque plastic bag from his suitcase, also marked with the name Mimir. Dr. Faustus was nothing if not prepared. About to put his charge inside the bag, he paused before putting away the plastic bag back into the suitcase. His new friend would make his next task much easier. Dr. Faustus made it to the staff-only section near the top of the ship, the control room. Here, normally the captain, along with his first officers and all the most important staff, would remain. Surely this was the most secure section of the ship, and the one that was holding what he needed. Knocking at the waterproof door, Dr. Faustus yelled through it. "Help! I'm not bitten, but those things are following me," he lied through the steel door, the severed head at his side, hidden away from an easy view. Sure enough, not even a minute after he knocked at the door, the seals hissed and the door began to open. It took nearly 30 seconds before it was finally wide enough for Faustus to walk through. On the other side of the door was the captain, judging by his hat and badge. "Oh, thank you so much. Can you please hold this for me?" Faustus asked, handing the severed head to the confused captain, who held the head, not aware what it was at first. He became aware very quickly when Mimir bit into his belly. While Mimir kept the captain busy, Faustus continued his walk into the control room. There were no other staff here. It looked like the captain kept true to his word that all staff were to head to their quarters. Oh well, too bad for him. Dr. Faustus found what he was looking for just beneath the console. A very bright orange, a very large box. The infamous black box, the keeper of the logs and information of what happened on the shift in case it crashed or sank. Despite the name, it was painted bright orange to make it easy to see in debris. Lugging the heavy contraption in one arm, he picked up Mimir in his other arm, tearing him away from the bleeding captain. The captain, in shock, was busy trying to pull his entrails back into his body. The intestines were still pulsing and moving, even outside the body, much like a snake trying to escape from the captain's grasp. Very few people knew that the intestines kept moving, even when removed from the body. Dr. Faustus left him there, to die, or turn. He didn't care which. Making his way down to the waterline, Dr. Faustus listened to the glorious chaos around him. The moans grew louder, and there were screams of pain, screams of fear, and the best screams of all were those that would cut out before the scream finished. Those, the good doctor was certain, would never scream ever again. Still though, even in beautiful moments like this, there were those that insisted on ruining it. Some of the screams were in words, which, in Faustus's opinion, only made the screams less pure. It was like adding sugar to chocolate. It was already beautifully bitter all by itself, but there were those who thought adding something would add value without corrupting it. Help me. Why is this happening? Can you please help me? Good God, what's happening? Please help me. The cries for help were the worst to Faustus. He was busy. Why did people insist on asking for help just because he was walking by? Sometimes he had more important things to do. Not everyone in the world was obligated to help just because they were dying. Why, if he had to stop to help someone just because he saw they were dying, he would hardly have time to do what he wanted to do. Finally, at the waterline, Dr. Faustus found what he was looking for: the tending boat. Big cruise ships, like the Naglfari, were often too big for most docks, so a smaller boat was kept on board to help the passengers get to shore without having to climb up or down a massive gangway. On the tending ship, Faustus began the process of casting off, setting Mimir on the chair while he stood. It took him only a few minutes, but the Naglfari was now behind the good doctor, the black box was on the ground by his feet, and the severed head was in his chair. Now confident in his escape, Dr. Faustus took this chance to remove the second plastic bag out of his suitcase to place Mimir inside. A perfect place to keep his best moneymaker. A few miles away from the Naglfari, Dr. Faustus found his goal: a much smaller ship. It had a unique symbol on the side: a sun surrounded by 8 crescent moons, the sign of the buyer, Madrigal Inc. The ship's name in big golden letters that glittered even in starlight was called Justice. Irony, if the good doctor had ever seen it before. Ahoy! He called up to the ship. A cloaked figure on the deck waved down before throwing a rope ladder to the side as it descended down. In just a moment, the hooded figure stood in front of Dr. Faustus. A person who the good doctor could not see under the hood, but someone Faustus was certain he could deal. I have what you want. First, I have the black box, Faustus said, pointing at the orange box. The figure shook its head and gestured to the side of the boat. You want the black box in the ocean? He asked. The figure nodded in return. Well, you bought it. You're right. He shrugged before picking up the box and throwing it into the water. A flood of bubbles washed to the surface before the box disappeared into the waves forever. When it washed away under the ocean, the figure produced a piece of paper with ink on it. A check written out to Auras with 9 figures. Faustus pocketed the check eagerly, removing his phone next. Well, next for you, I got video evidence of what Samdi syndrome can do, Dr. Faustus said, pulling out his phone and holding the screen up to the figure's hood before playing the video. The figure's hood didn't reflect any light, and the good doctor was certain whatever was under that hood was something even he didn't want to see. The figure watched the video in full before it nodded and held its hand out. It wanted the phone. I mean, I guess. You owe me the newest model, though, Faustus warned, which the figure only nodded again. When Faustus handed his phone over, it disappeared somewhere within the figure's cloak, before, in the figure's other hand, a new phone appeared that it offered to Faustus. Sure enough, when Faustus checked the apps and contacts on the phone, it was his phone. All of his information was on it, with the exception of the video he handed to the figure. Well, at least the figure played fair. Faustus figured he knew magical ink was powerful, but he only knew a few mages who played like this figure, none of whom the good doctor wanted to make mad. And last but not least, the severed head Mimir, a living sample of Samdi syndrome, Faustus said, lifting up the squirming plastic bag. This item the figure snatched out eagerly from Faustus's hand, tearing it open and peering inside. Careful, it bites, the doctor warned with a chuckle. But the figure didn't care. If Faustus could see its face, he was certain it would be smiling like a clown. Now, for what I came here for, Faustus asked, holding his hand out. This time, the figure withdrew something from its cloak. It was about the size of a snow globe, and it was made out of pure crystal. In the center of the crystal orb was a single feather. The barbs were as golden as the sun, and the down was as silver as the moon, with a hollow shaft as crimson as fresh blood. This artifact was far too pure to exist in Pandemonium, and far too divine to come from Earth. When taken, it cuts the hand that clutches it. When given, it heals the hand that holds it, the hermit finally said as it handed the crystal to Dr. Faustus, who held the fragile item with all the care in the world. Another piece of his puzzle, but one he knew he traded another piece of the hermit's puzzle for. I don't suppose Mimir would have anything to do with the 13th Arcana, would it? Faustus asked with a smile, only for the hermit to raise its hand. Speak carefully, or never speak again, the hermit warned. Well, you're no fun. Dr. Faustus sighed before offering his hand to the hermit. Pleasure doing business with you, he offered. The hermit glanced at the hand and instead chose to start climbing the rope ladder again, not even touching Dr. Faustus's hand. The head also vanished into its cloak. Well, I guess I deserved that, he said, looking around before he realized. Wait, how do I get to land from here? he wondered out loud as the larger boat began to leave his small tending boat. Sochi couldn't sleep on the ship that was bringing them all to the Naglfari. While she laid in the bottom bunk looking up at the mattress above, her husband, Michikoto, or Mitch to his friends, slept soundly in the top bunk. And across from Sochi was Maria, Michikoto's cousin. This all wasn't news to Sochi. Maria worked hard and retained a lot of information, but when she wasn't working, she was often sleeping. So naturally she could sleep through the motion. And Michikoto, being her cousin, naturally inherited some of that too. Sighing to herself, Sochi got up and quietly walked to the deck of the ship. She wasn't an expert on ships, so she couldn't say what kind of boat it was. She did know it was a vanguard ship, often used in search and rescue operations. A large green caduceus on the flag on the back of the ship fluttered while it moved as quickly as it safely could from Isle City to the Naglfari, somewhere in Oceanus. Around Sochi's ship, other boats followed along. Most of them were also vanguard, including a very large floating hospital, a ship made for the treatment of thousands, made from an old converted oil tanker. Other boats weren't part of the vanguard fleet, but they were still here to help. 2 or 3 of the boats were from hunters from the guild who wanted to help out today, especially once they heard about the bounty for helping out. One final ship that didn't belong to the vanguard fleet was a very fancy yacht that was leading the ships to the Naglfari, owned by one Ian Avid, an insurance adjuster whose company was supposed to pay out for the loss of the Naglfari. Naturally, cruise ships are very expensive, well over 1 billion centi just in construction, not including things like stock, staff, and seasoning, all of which adds up pretty quickly, and the loss of which only raises the amount of money insurance is paying out to the cruise company. So naturally, it was the job of someone like Ian Avid to try and recover some of the money back. He had to go out and see how badly damaged the ship was, see if any of the stock could be recovered, if any of the staff survived, and of course, if the ship itself could be recovered. Even if the ship was only sailing scrap and shattered steel, that was still salvageable centi, compared to, say, 1 billion centi of rust on the bottom of the ocean. And that was where people like Sochi and the Vanguard came in. Ian was paying every volunteer who was here to help him reclaim the ship 2 million centi each. Everyone from the doctors, nurses, hunters, sailors to the hands were all being paid 2 million each. Why so much? Well, the job had a lot more risk than a standard salvage job. 9 hours ago, the captain called the Vanguard for assistance, stating that there was likely an outbreak of Samdi syndrome on the Naglfari, and immediate aid was needed. There hasn't been contact with the ship since that message, which leads to the worst possible conclusion. A ship with 6,000 Samdi syndrome sufferers waiting to create a cataclysm with anyone who collided with the cruise ship. So, high risk naturally led to high rewards. But it still led to a net positive for the insurance agency. Even if 300 people volunteered, each being paid 2 million, that was still less than the billion the insurance was expecting to get out of the ship. And if Sochi was to guess, there were maybe 100 volunteers in this fleet, and not everyone was a hunter. There was her husband. There was Claudius Clyde Caron, the ghost hunter, Henry Hanno, the navigator, Talia Tybalt, the true tactician, and Bethany Brixham, the brigand of Bath. 6 hunters and quite possibly 6,000 sufferers. The sun started to rise in front of Sochi, and as her breath visibly fogged the early motion air, She whispered to her help. "This is going to be easy," she said to herself as she started to see the ship silhouetted in the sunrise. Not long afterwards, everyone else woke up and gathered on the floating hospital deck. There, Ian was standing on a box of ropes while everyone gathered and muttered around. The doctors and nurses bunched together, all of their blue scrubs with a prominent green caduceus in a white circle. The circle was a symbol of neutrality. It showed that they were just professionals doing their job, apolitical and willing to work for any side. Useful if going into a war zone, or in a fight between heroes and villains. The hands, sailor staff, who were essential for keeping boats running, were still dressed in their work clothes. No symbols nor any iconography. They couldn't risk having any. But they were the most populous group, and they were assembled with everyone at Maria's request, even though Ian didn't want them to be. She wanted everything in this meeting to be clear to everyone. And the final and smallest group was the hunters themselves. Sochi was in her husband's arm while they stood near the front, not wanting to miss a single word. Sochi's hand rested on the crest on her husband's chest. A golden heater, with antlers growing out of it, with a single green line bisecting it. A match to the crest on Sochi's chest. The heater was an old symbol for representing protection, being the same shape as a shield. Even in this modern day, it still represented someone who sees themselves as a shield to the dangers of the world. Not a sword. Not merely a hunter, but a hero. And so she could feel the stares from the other hunters. Almost no other hunters took on the mantle of hero anymore. Most hunters were like Claudius and Talia. They did a job and they didn't try to proclaim themselves as heroes. Their crests were simple circles. Claudius's crest was a ghost with a target in his head within the circle, and Talia's was a simple diagonal purple stripe through the circle. Claudius Clyde Charon was a private hunter who specialized in hunting and killing ghosts and other types of undead. He was lucky enough to make enough for a living. For a lot of private hunters, trying to make money was harder than working as a traveling salesman. But lately there have been rumors that Claudius robbed his last client for trying to skip out on a payment. He was dressed in a Kevlar vest with a wide brim hat, with his 2 pistols at his side within easy reach. His face covered by a bandana with only his eyes truly visible. Talia Tybalt, the true tactician, was a hunter working directly for the Empire of the Seven Cities. Sochi wasn't sure of her exact role to the Emperor, but she was certain it was quite important if she got to wear purple as part of her crest. Unlike Claudius, she had no shortage of work nor resources. She had everything from paid time off that could be measured in months, weapons that could be classified as war crimes if it was ever used outside the Seven Cities, expense reports larger than most people's salaries, and enough paperwork to drown a bureau of bureaucrats. Even now, dressed in her all-black armor and black mask that covered her mouth, she was on a tablet filling out even more paperwork while waiting for the speech to start. Her weapon was a standard infantry rifle with a bayonet, all slung across her back. When Sochi peered around, it took her time until she was able to find the last 2 hunters. In the far back, away from anyone, was Bethany Brixham and Henry Hanno, both isolated from everyone else, with their crest neither a heater nor a circle. It was an oval-shaped cartouche, a symbol that they considered themselves first. Bethany Brixham, the Brigand of Bath, had a green arrow in her cartouche. She was dressed like any traveler in Albion, except for her cap, which had a single raven feather. Sochi was certain, though, despite the casual look, she was well armored and well armed. She was infamous for leaving bandits in Albion stealing from the wealthy and gifting much of it to the villagers who either joined or sheltered her. She also led her brigands of bandits to killing monsters that lived on the roads. Some said she did that to help keep the villagers safe. Others said she did that because she didn't like having competition on her roads. But whichever was true, she was here to help liberate the Naglfari, but she still paled in comparison to her companion. Henry Hanno, the navigator, was a large man who carried a lot of strength in his stride. His cartouche was an anchor within a compass. He was famous for taking on the largest monsters the sea had to offer in his modified ship, the Keto, one of the ships of the Vanguard fleet now, willing to help take the Naglfari. He had taken on Kraken, Kaiju, and Chronosaurus all alike. Tales of him taking on city-destroying monsters were legendary, but unlike Bethany, his reasons for hunting the monsters at sea were very clear. He was protecting his business. Henry Hanno, the navigator, was a pirate and a smuggler. Still, though, Sochi was confident where all the others stood. They could be trusted as far as the money went. And she didn't need to like the others, she just needed to be able to work with them. And she had to do a lot worse for a lot less with a lot worse in the past. Ian cleared his throat while he finally spoke on his rope box. Welcome everyone. So, I'm Ian Avid. I'm the insurance adjuster for the owners of the Naglfari. So, we think that there's an outbreak of Samdi syndrome on board the Naglfari. So, you're all hired to clear away the infected. Once it's done, you would be paid 2 million centi each. Are there any questions? He asked the group. Charon called up to Ian. How many sufferers are on board? Well, we have no way to know that. Do you know how we'll clear them all out? Well, I thought you had an idea before now. Do we have any auto-injectors before we go on board? Any what? Ian responded, completely confused. Charon sighed while one of the sailors threw a wet rag at Ian, who looked like he was about to start crying. Thankfully, Maria got out of the crowd and tapped Ian on the shoulder, whispering to him, "Let me take over." Maria's shirt matched both Michikoto and Sochi's chest, but unlike the other two, Maria was staying on the ship, making tactical choices and acting as support. She thankfully managed to do a lot of research before today, so she was ready to answer some questions for the crowd, while Ian quickly did his best to try and disappear. Now, to answer some questions. We don't know how many on board are turned into Samdi syndrome sufferers, but the Naglfari was carrying 6,000 people when it left Albion. But with the possibility of survivors, the number is likely lower than that. But still, for tactical reasons, we have to assume the number is as high as 6,000 until proven otherwise. And as for how we're going to clear them all out, the tending ship is missing, so we can send hunters through the tending area, both to evacuate survivors and to clear out the damned. But for clearing out, most of them, we don't need to put ourselves at risk. Henry, you're going to take the Keto to the far side of the Naglfari, and use the speakers to attract as many as you can overboard. The Baron's Bacillus cannot infect a non-humanoid host, so the sharks and the fish will clear them out for us. We should be able to clear out the majority of the sufferers out easily. Well, except for the ones that can't reach the upper decks, the ones that can't hear it, those that are too injured to move or locked away in their rooms. Before Talia could continue, Maria interrupted her. Thank you, Talia, but this is the only way to safely reduce the number of sufferers without either completely destroying the ship or killing all possible survivors. If you have any other better plan that doesn't put others at risk, I am happy to listen. Maria responded, pausing for a moment before Talia sighed and nodded. Okay, that's a good plan, but there's still going to be a lot of sufferers, remember that. Talia finished before Maria continued. At that point, it'll be up to us to clear out the ship. Henry and Bethany will be guarding the tending area. There will be a ship that will connect to the floating hospital. Any survivors will be brought in to be examined by doctors. The uninfected will be evacuated by boat. The infected will receive treatment in the floating hospital until they've all been cleared. This time, it was a doctor who raised her hand and asked, Wait, treatment? I thought once bitten you became a zombie and nothing could fix that and they had to be put down like a rabid dog. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Sochi knew that Maria hated dealing with ignorance, especially from those that were supposed to be professionals, and Sochi could feel the painful pang from that profoundly poor proposal. Even the other hunters felt that pain, and they knew it well. After 5 awkward seconds, she finally spoke. No. Treatment is possible up until the final stage of infection. The SAMD syndrome sufferers, or sufferers for short. While zombie is technically taxonomically true, it's also immeasurably imprecise. There's over 24 forms of undead that we know about. Prometheans, ghouls, somnambulists, revenants, possessed, necrophages, sufferers, and the 11th plague all come to mind. Any one of those can technically be called a zombie by the layman, but it's also so imprecise. Most hunters don't use the term zombie except in the broadest of terms, because words mean things. And a few words can make or break a hunt if we don't understand what we're dealing with. There's times to be precise, and this is certainly one of them. Well, I'm still going to keep calling them zombies, the doctor said, not caring about what Maria just explained. Very well, nurse. We'll be sure to refer to all illness and injuries as owies while around you. I'm actually a doctor, and it's actually SAMD syndrome sufferers, nurse. Maria finished before pivoting to her next statement. Now, treatment for the Baron Bacillus, the bacteria that causes SAMD syndrome, is broad-spectrum antibiotics. There should be enough antibiotics and saline cocktails to cure the Naglfari 3 times over. The hunters are going on in, and all hands are expected to carry auto-injectors. Maria removed a plastic object from her pocket, the size of a large pen. Remember, the orange side gets pressed to the thigh, and you push the blue side. It releases an injection of epinephrine, bacterial interferon, and broad-spectrum antibiotics. The epinephrine keeps the heart going, it opens the lungs, and increases blood pressure, allowing the interferon to keep the bacteria from reproducing, while the antibiotics start to kill the bacteria. Bear in mind, the auto-injectors will not cure the disease, but it will buy time. Anywhere from 15 minutes to 4 hours, depending on the severity of infection. Now, doctors, treat this like a case of flesh-eating disease. Amputation should be an absolute last resort, so only consider it if it's the only way to save the patient. But antibiotics and fluids will be your first and best course of treatment. Now, for tactics with the sufferers. Their primary form of infection is either biting or projectile vomiting, so long range is preferred over everything else. If they're freshly turned, they can move quickly, but after they've been turned for more than an hour, both rigor mortis and necrosis severely slow the sufferers. And of course, severe brain trauma will kill them. Not merely shooting them in the brain, but also smashing their heads into a wall or the ground. The skull doesn't even need to break open to kill them. Their tactics are they usually are solitary hunters, but they can swarm. They aren't intelligent, they can't even use weapons, but they are still dangerous. They like to follow sound and bright lights if they can see it. The ones that can still smell will detect meat, but usually the rot overpowers any other scent. And remember, their bones, teeth, and fingers can still be dangerous. So please be careful. We don't want to pay out any life insurance policies just yet. That last sentence brought out a nervous laugh in the group. It was a dangerous day doing a dangerous task. Addressing it and making any jokes helped reduce stress and tension. Life insurance policies for these professions paid well, but most hunters didn't have anyone left to benefit from them. Now, vernacular, verbiage, and values aside, remember the 5 priorities on this mission. These are very important. I want everyone from the hands, the help, the hunters, and the hounds to remember and understand this deep in your jellies. Our first priority is the safety of the survivors of SAMD syndrome sufferers. Even above your own life, their safety is important. We all agreed to be here. They didn't agree to be a part of this. Their safety comes first. Didn't they pay to be on this boat? The doctor from before asked. They didn't pay to be snapped by sufferers. We're here to help them. Their safety comes first. This was met by quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. Maria waited for a moment for the crowd to quiet down before she continued speaking. Our second priority is ourselves. If there's no passengers at risk, then there's no reason to put ourselves at risk. Our safety is put ahead of the destruction of the dead. If you have a choice between destroying the dead or saving the self, save yourself. If you live to fight another day, you can be here to fight more of the sufferers instead of adding to their ranks. This message was met with murmurs of a very different tone, a more argumentative tone. Quite a few people who joined this mission were fully willing to sacrifice themselves to help someone else, but keeping yourself safe to help someone else was something else entirely. Sochi felt it from the crowd. Those who were comfortable with the idea of helping others, but were so much more uncomfortable with the idea of helping themselves. That was the problem when you had a group of people willing to jump into a bonfire to save a stuffed animal. They were also the kind of people willing to jump into the fire before someone could get a fire extinguisher. So, a firm reminder was needed that keeping yourself safe was also a priority. Not just because keeping yourself safe would give you a chance to save others later, like Maria said, but also because you're a person too. And it would be your responsibility to help keep yourself safe if you're keeping people safe. Yeah, I know, but think about it this way. If you survive, you save more people. This time the grumbles were more of an agreement, as Sochi cuddled more in her husband's embrace. He didn't grumble either time, but Sochi knew why he didn't grumble. Not because he was afraid of sacrifice or death, but because he was scared of leaving Sochi alone in the world. So he kept himself safe, not just for himself, but also for her. And she knew deep in her heart that she loved him deeply, and she also feared leaving him. The third priority is destroying the damned dead. The bacteria can't survive 2 hours without a host. If we can kill them all, then the biohazard crew can come in and clean out the bile, blood, and bodies in safety from SAMD syndrome. As long as killing the dead isn't going to create harm for yourself or a passenger, feel free to fragment them all. The fourth priority is the reason we're all getting paid. The ship behind us is meant to be in some salvageable shape to sail and sell. Maria gestured to the ship behind her. The ship behind us is bringing in the money for Ian's employer, who pays us. Now, obviously, we're not going to protect the limbo court over human lives, nor are we going to avoid killing a sufferer for standing in front of an open bar. But that doesn't mean you can just smash something because you can, and you cannot loot from the ship. Any reasonable expectation that you're looting from the ship will be deducted from your stipend. That part brought a loud sigh from both Henry and Bridget. They were likely thinking about looting from the ship, but if there was a cost to their theft, it may discourage them from stealing. Or it might be an even greater challenge, because even from so far away, Sochi was certain she could see a bright smile in Bridget's eyes and in the wrinkles of Henry's face. Even without a visible smile, Sochi had her way of figuring what someone was feeling. Those two were terrifying when they were happy, and Sochi was certain that the fourth priority made it worse, not better. "Are there any questions?" Maria asked, her arms crossed, waiting for a question. At first, there was silence until the doctor raised her hand and asked, "Didn't you say there were 5 priorities? What's the 5th priority?" the doctor asked Maria. "Well, of course, nurse. The 5th priority is obviously have fun," Maria said, throwing her arms out like she was celebrating a surprise party. That brought another nervous laugh to the group, while the doctor stood there red in face from how angry they were. "Are you ever going to get my title right?" he called out to Maria. Probably not. Now, let's go," she called out, and everyone went to their stations to prepare. Not long after this speech, Sochi sat across from Michikoto with the other hunters, while they waited on the boat for the go-ahead from Maria. On the far side of the Naglfari, the Keto was announcing a very loud, pre-prepared speech to attract the attention of the sufferers, but also to reassure any survivors left on board. "We are here to help you. Even if you are bitten, we can cure you. Stay safe until Vanguard arrives." It was short but simple. After a 2-second pause, it played again. Even though Sochi couldn't see what was happening, she could hear it from her side. Even over the loudspeakers, when the tape was playing, she could hear the sound of a lot of things landing into the ocean. It was nearly continuous for 30 minutes before it turned quiet for the last 5 minutes. Sochi knew it wasn't her fault, but she still felt a tear come into her eyes, even away from the sight. All of the sufferers were dangerous, but she also knew that they were once people. People who were living life and who wanted to just enjoy themselves before it ended so suddenly, and then they became threats to others. Death was already tragic by itself, but death that brings death to others felt like a game of never-ending dominoes. A single death could lead to billions if left alone, but the only way to stop more death was with death and destruction. Maria already explained to Sochi many times that the sufferers were no longer living in a traditional sense, that they were nothing more than bearers of the Baron's Bacillus. But still, the idea of looking into someone's eyes, someone she may very well recognize, or someone she had never seen, and telling that person that they needed to die to prevent more death, felt counterintuitive in her heart, even if it made sense in her head. She felt tears dripping down her cheeks, and she felt her husband's hand resting on her own. "I know it's hard, but it gets easier. We can still keep what happened to them from happening to others. You've never seen one of them before, but once you've seen them, it'll be easier. But just know, no matter what happens in there, you have me with you the entire time," Michikoto reassured her. So she felt his other hand brush away the tear on her cheek. Times like these made Sochi wonder if it was actually Michikoto who was the empath. Sadly, like many other sweet moments, this one was interrupted. "What, are you two planning a pact? Just know, if it's going to get messy in there, do it away from me, please. My clothes are very expensive," Bridget called out to them.
Sochi felt Michikoto tense, and then she whispered to him, "Let it go. It isn't worth it." She whispered to her husband, who let out a long exhale, not even dignifying the statement with an acknowledgement, let alone a response. They had dealt with people being rude in all kinds of ways. A lot of people of all kinds of stripes saw people like Sochi and Michikoto as stupid, if not suicidal, for declaring themselves heroes. Acting like a shield for others also meant that you were putting yourself in danger to keep others out of it. But the dangers were not just from the monsters of the world, but oftentimes they came from those that you were protecting. Folks like Claudius and Talia had the advantage of being professionals, so they could argue a contract and stop where the contract ended, but they could do so with a clear conscience when they chose not to do extra to help others. People like Henry and Bridget, however, could be as selfish as they wanted without anyone being surprised by what they did. They could rob a stagecoach, kidnap a royal, create terror across the 7 cities, and no one would bat an eye. They could even decide to do something selfless, like save a ship or save a person's life, and people would assume that it was a normal thing. After all, any action done by a selfish person was inherently a selfish action, even if they were helping someone else, right? But by choosing to call yourself a selfless person, a hero, like her and her husband did, every action was judged by those in front of you that you fought, and by those behind you that you protected and trusted. They would stare, waiting for any chance for you to slip up, any chance to declare that you, the heroes, were secretly villains this entire time. It was frustrating, exhausting, and a great burden. Being a shield meant that you would be struck at by enemies and pushed at by your allies, but it also meant that you were keeping others safe, some of whom would go on to do great things themselves. Even years later, even here in the boat, Sochi still remembered that young girl in Shepherd, that light in her eyes, the strength in her stride, and that spark in her heart. Someone who had everything to lose and nothing to gain, and she still pushed forward with everything she had. And she won, snatching her friend from the jaws of sacrifice and spiders. Someone that even years later, her husband and herself still talked about, and they still wonder if she was doing well. Bridget, though, seeing she wasn't getting a response, sighed and stared into the water. "I'm bored. When will we go in?" she whined, just as the radio crackled to life and Maria's voice came through. "You're clear. Tender and clear. Good luck, team. Out," Maria said as the boat drifted to the tending area. As they approached, Michikoto readied his crossbow. It was a modified crossbow of his own design. It held up to 13 bolts and could be reloaded in seconds. Each bolt was carbon fiber with obsidian tips, each tip matching the obsidian crystal Michikoto kept around his neck. Sochi saw him kill many dangerous creatures with that crossbow, and knew for certain it was an Olympia-class weapon. The obsidian was blessed by a god. Sochi's weapons were a bit simpler. She had her knives, and she had plenty of them, hardened carbon steel, and she carried over 2 dozen, including her throwing knife. Her largest knife, that she jokingly referred to as Sunset, rested in her right hand as the boat made contact in the tending area. Her only other weapon was herself. The tending area was a room that was once white, with rows upon rows of cloth barriers for showing where people would stand in line to make it to the tending boat before heading to shore. But now, the barriers were all knocked down, and the floors and wall were covered with brown blood. In the movies, blood was always red, even hours or days afterward. But the reality was far grosser. Blood still coagulates and dries, so it often turned brown, especially after exposure to the Baron's bacillus. The room smelled really bad, like a rotting butcher shop. But fortunately all the hunters had the foresight to rub menthol under their noses to reduce the smell. Unfortunately, it made everything smell like mint. "Looks clear, let's go," Michikoto said, stepping into the tending area first, followed by everyone else. He led to the door, standing just to the side, gesturing to Sochi. "You first," he said with a smile. This wasn't a courtesy, like ladies first at the mall. This had an actual tactical advantage, and Sochi took a deep breath and closed her eyes as she pressed her hand against the door. She let her senses feel what was behind, trying to see if there was any presence nearby that might be a threat. It worked best with people, but in her experience it also worked with monsters almost as well. After a few beats, she withdrew her hand and spoke. "No immediate threat, but there is one about 30 meters to the left, about 296 degrees," Sochi told her husband, who nodded and opened the door and immediately loosed the bolt at Sochi's predicted location. Sure enough, there was a sufferer there. It was too far for Sochi to see it clearly, but it looked like it was dressed in a bikini that used to be white, but was now stained with various body fluids. But it was now dead again, and they could all breathe easily. "Everyone remembers their roles?" Michikoto asked the group. They nodded as they began to split up. Michikoto and Sochi would take the parts of the ship that were above the waterline. Claudius Clyde Charon and Talia Tybalt would be taking all the ship below the waterline, while Henry Hanno and Bridget Brixham would be guarding the tending area to help protect the escape route and the floating hospital that was docking to the boat in the tender area. Following the hallway around the desk, Sochi and Michikoto paid careful attention, wanting to leave as little to surprise as possible. On this deck was a restroom. The first room was empty, a bit dirty, but no more than was to be expected. There wasn't even blood in it. The second restroom, though, was a different story altogether. It looked locked on the inside, but they were uncertain if there was anyone still inside. So, naturally, Sochi pressed her hand against the door to see what she could feel. Behind the door, a few feet away, she could feel someone curled up on the ground, but she couldn't tell if they were living or dead. Just that they were there, and they were likely hurt. Shaking her head to Michikoto, she decided to try something else. Sochi knocked on the door. "Is there anyone there? If you're all right, please knock once. If you need help, please knock twice," she said. She was hopeful it was someone who needed help, but with the door closed like this, everything was uncertain. The door could be hiding someone who was sick and injured, but managed to get away, and now they were desperate for some kind of help, and hearing Sochi's voice was a blessing. Or, alternatively, what was in there used to be someone who was injured, someone who managed to lock the door thinking that they were keeping a dangerous threat away from the rest of the ship. But now, they were the threat. But right now the door was closed, and right now the person behind it was both dead and alive until it was opened and verified. It came from near the floor, but that brought relief to both Sochi's heart, and she could see the relief on Michikoto's face also. "Back away from the door. I'm going to break it down now," Sochi warned. After giving it a few moments and confident that the person on the other side was safe, she balled her hand into a fist and drew it back. The doors on the restroom were made of steel. Their door handles were also steel, with a deadbolt that was supposed to be able to hold back over 400 pounds of force. It took Sochi one punch to break through and allow herself to unlock the door. Opening the door let the light onto one terrified young man. "What are you?" he asked, staring at the damage of the door and the lack of damage on Sochi's fist. Sochi relaxed her fist and lifted her hand out to the man on the floor. "I'm with Vanguard. We're here to get you out. Do you have any bites? We have treatment if you're bitten." No bites, and you're with Vanguard. Does that mean the Coastal Guardians are here?" he asked. Sochi could tell he was too flustered to even try to lie. He also didn't have any visible bites and no veins that were starting to turn necrotic. He reached out to her hand while she helped pull him up. "No, sadly the Coastal Guardians are all still in Isle City. Doesn't mean we aren't here to help you," Sochi said as both her and Michikoto helped guide the man back to the ship. He was still in shock and he was not speaking, but instead he just focused walking step by step. Finally, back in the tender area, the Vanguard took the man off their hands and took him back to the hospital ship. The man safe, Sochi and Michikoto turned back to the ship and continued their sweep. The rest of the deck that was at the waterline was empty, so they first opened the elevators and found them blood-smeared but empty. So they continued their trek up via the stairs. The Naglfari had two major sets of stairs, one in the stern and one in the bow. The plan was to take the bow stairs first up to the top deck of the ship, and then clear it out, heading down via the stairs in the stern. Starting in the bow and ending in the stern meant that the sun was always behind them and not blinding them. It also worked against the SAMD sufferers. They weren't attracted to sunlight like they were artificial light, but their eyes were still very human, so even they could be blinded by the sun. Now on the top deck, both Sochi and Michikoto could see the dead underneath. Down below in some sort of open-air atrium? Sochi was unsure of the term, but it was the big open-air area where most of the pools, slides, and kid zone and play areas were offloaded on the Naglfari. She could see that there were still sufferers striding and struggling along. "How many do you see?" Michikoto asked while he removed his backpack and braced his crossbow to the top of the railing to give himself more stability. There were more than a few out there, and taking the opportunity to snipe them before they could be a threat would make it much easier to clear out any survivors that were still on board. Sochi glanced over the sufferers below and quickly did a count. It didn't take long, but she gave her count to her husband. "I count 38 sufferers. There's likely more in the dark area of the hallways, but that is how many I can see on the deck below, so you got this," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his back for a moment while he focused through his scope. "Please watch my back," he asked her while his breaths decreased and his focus increased. Sochi was familiar with this state of her husband's. He was focusing everything he had in his shots. His breath slowed as he figured every shot before it occurred. He was considering everything from the wind, the motion of the cruise ship, the location of his target, gravity, the curvature of the planet, and even his breath and heartbeat were all factors that were going into his shots. And not a single one could afford to miss. Michikoto let out another exhale and loosed a bolt. He then inhaled, and when he exhaled, another bolt was released before the sufferers could notice that the others of their kind were dropping. This specific tactic of Michikoto's was called the breath and death. After every inhale, he lined his next shot, and with every exhale, he fired. His breath was slow, and the death he brought was quick. Less than a minute, he reloaded and then was firing again, all in one fluid motion. No distractions from within or without. A few minutes later, 38 bodies laid still on the deck. Michikoto waited in silence before he whispered to Sochi. "Do the 5-word test," he said while he waited for anyone or anything else that was about to come out. It would be Sochi's job to do the 5-word test. "Does the black moon howl?" Sochi called out. The howls that echoed back were certainly not from the black moon, even if they were unsettling enough to come from it. And sure enough, 6 sufferers slouched and slunk from the ship's shadows and straight into Michikoto's shots. Soon they struggled no more, and Michikoto nodded to Sochi, asking for her to do another 5-word test. "Does the black moon howl?" she called out, and the only response was her own echo before her husband stood and gave his response. "Only when she bleeds." "Are you all right?" she asked, examining him to see if there were any cuts or injuries. "I'm fine. Every bolt found its mark. Now, let's go find ours," Michikoto said before wincing at his word choice. "I mean, we go find survivors now," he said as they continued down and through the ship. And this was where things got very depressing in Sochi's opinion. There were almost no survivors. There were a few. A kids zone attendant with 2 children and a father with his 2 children, but no one else was found. Room after room, seemingly never-ending nightmare from Lockhart. Room after room they knocked, and Sochi checked, only to find out there was no body inside, or worse, that there were bodies inside, but no survivors. One particularly harsh room was full of children, with an older man in red and a white beard, who was dead in the corner, too devoured to come back as a sufferer. The children all had torn remnants of ropes around their arms and chests. The rope burns on their arms and the shattered piece of rope along the floor, along with where the bites were placed, made it very clear. These children were tied up for a long time before infection hit, and then the children turned on each other, one after another, before they all broke out and attacked the man, all at once. Sochi couldn't watch while her husband did what he had to do, and she stood outside the room looking at the many bodies on the deck and in the hallway. They were easier to deal with than with the children inside. Michikoto and Sochi were hunters. They destroyed monsters, and they were heroes. They protected people. But times like this, where the monsters and the people were clearly reversed, she could barely breathe. The world wasn't supposed to be this harsh, or at least she was supposed to be stronger to handle it. Both of those things felt so false in moments like this. What she felt was Michikoto's warm hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said, embracing her. Sochi could feel it inside of him. He was taking it hard too. Even if he wasn't showing it on the outside, didn't mean that it wasn't affecting him too. But they wouldn't have long before they had to continue and face even more monsters of the Naglfari. But they could be together for a moment. When they stopped holding each other and Michikoto pulled Sochi up, they both knew it was time to keep going. Things weren't better, not by any means, but they knew that they could face what was happening. They could talk about it later, and they would focus on the problems in front of them and not let the worries of the past bother them. If they could focus on what was in front of them, they could ignore everything behind them. Ahead of them was the control room. Unlike most doors on the ship, it was neither broken down nor sealed. It was open and it had blood on the floor and door. But the captain and crew were nowhere to be seen. Michikoto gestured forward. Let's see if we can find the black box. It'll let us know what happened. There's no way so many people refused to quarantine. Did they? He asked, leading forward while Soichi followed behind listlessly. As soon as Michikoto stepped through the door, on the other side, just out of sight, a necrotic arm grabbed his neck and pulled him towards sharp teeth. Michikoto, in a panic, fired his bolt wildly, and it struck the window, creating a loud crack, and he screamed even louder from the pain as scarlet blood began to flow down his shoulder. The sufferer screeched in glee from the smell and tried to tear into Michikoto like a rabid animal. While Michikoto's right arm was pinned down with his crossbow pointing away, and his left arm, with his shoulder injured, could only weakly push the sufferer back by pressing his hand against its foul face. Soichi had no time to think about what she was doing. All she could do was react. She drew her blade, Sunset, from its sheath and threw it with all of the force she could muster. The blade buried itself up to its hilt in the sufferer's skull. The sharp blade he struck between Michikoto's fingers as the sufferer fell to the ground with its open entrails dragging after itself. Michikoto held his shoulder while Soichi ran towards him. "Are you bitten?" she asked, worried about him. "No, but my crossbow bolt," he started but stopped, barely able to stand. He kept pressing his shirt into his wound on his shoulder, which was still flowing with blood. Soichi understood then, though. Every bolt that was fired from that crossbow would draw blood. That was the price for using the blessed obsidian as the arrow tip. If the bolts didn't draw blood from a target, then it was Michikoto who paid the blood price. "I'll get you off the ship," she promised while she crouched down and lifted him onto his shoulders. His left arm held in her arms, and his right arm elevated. Like she was a firefighter, she carried him with ease. "But the mission, our priorities are to..." "Second priority, we save people, and you're a person, Mitch," Soichi reminded him as she strode out of the captain's quarters, her thoughts on keeping him safe. "That's the only time you get to call me that," he joked in her ear as she was out in the hallway. Already she was trying to plot a way out to the floating hospital. Realizing it was going to take too long to take the hallway, Soichi peered over the railing and she could see the open path to the floating hospital. Only 8 floors down. "Mitch, I need you to close your eyes," she warned him. He didn't argue. He was tired, but he trusted her and he loved her. He knew when she said to close his eyes that he would need to listen and not argue. Soichi, confident in her husband's closed eyes, stood up on the railing, took a deep breath, and then took one final step forward. The free fall was peaceful, even relaxing at first, almost like being on a ride. A moment of weightlessness and a feeling that you were flying, that anything in the world was possible, and for a moment it was truly at peace with the universe. But then gravity caught up, and then you felt heavy as the sky tried to push you up, and the earth tried to pull you down. And every time, the earth won. Or, in Soichi's case, the earth almost always won. As she fell and fell, she let her strength flow through her. She felt the air push futilely against her, but she didn't let it be futile. Her fear for her husband and her love for her husband gave her the strength as she commanded the air between her and the rapidly approaching ground. She imposed her will upon it and ordered it, "Catch us." And the air obeyed. Sochi slowed down as she approached the ground floor, and when she landed it was with a thud, and she was still able to run forward with her husband on her shoulders, and her eyes now open when he felt the thud. He knew of what his wife was capable of doing, but he did possess a fear of falling, which she didn't want to set off when she jumped from the top deck to the bottom deck. In her experience, people going through experiences like that were more likely to be upset by the falling and a lot less impressed by the fact that they were not falling. Running her husband to the floating hospital, she blew past the hunters on guard and took him to a nearby bed. "He's hurt. He needs help," she called out to the waiting doctors while setting him on the bed. And they rushed towards him, and she took a step back. She was confident he would get better, but she also knew the importance of getting him treatment quickly. She sat on a stool in the waiting room near his bed, while the doctors had to perform surgery on his shoulder, and she couldn't be in the room while the surgery was done. They threw out a lot of terms she didn't understand, but what she did understand was that an artery was torn, and that if he was even a few minutes later, he would not have survived. Sochi sat in the chair, her leg jostling up and down, while waiting for the news if he was going to be all right. While she waited, she saw Maria approach with 2 cups of coffee. She sat next to Sochi, and the two of them were silent for a moment, while Maria sipped on a cup before she finally spoke. "The ship has been cleared. We ship out in an hour," she told Sochi, who only nodded in response. "Hey, he's going to pull through. He's been through worse," Maria offered, Sochi, who only nodded. "I'm sorry," Maria finally said, as Sochi felt something catch in her throat, and she just started sobbing and laughing at the same time. The fear, the danger, the anxiety, the absurdity of the entire last day finally caught up with her. She was finally safe, and she was finally allowed to have her panic and crash. Maria let her cry for a few minutes before Sochi calmed down enough to ask, Is he infected?" Sochi asked. Maria shook her head in response. "No, he was safe. He just got caught by the bolts. I keep telling him it's too dangerous to use those, but he's so insistent that the price of blood was a fair price for such a good weapon," Maria said, and Sochi giggled some at that statement. "Or how he throws himself into danger first. He knows what I am and what I can do, but he's still so willing to throw himself into danger first to keep me out of it, even if it doesn't hurt me," Sochi said, looking down at her hands. The same hands that broke steel and took a life and carried her love's life. All feats that would break a normal person. And her hands still looked normal as ever. They weren't even calloused. Her hands should be broken, bloody, or bruised. But here she was, whole as ever, and her husband was paying the price. "You know why he does that, right?" "Because he knows you hate fighting," Maria said as she sipped at her coffee. "Yeah, but he's caring like that. But I wish he considered the price of things first. It's like he'd sacrifice everything he has just to keep you safe." "Yeah, exactly." Maria sipped at her coffee again and told Sochi, "That's because you're his entire world. He'd give up on the entire world before he dreams about giving up on you," Maria finished. They sat in silence for a while before Sochi reached out for Maria's second cup of coffee, just as Maria drew her hand back. Whoa, 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 whoa. What are you doing? That's my coffee. You have two coffees. My coffee, Maria said as she drank from her second cup, bringing a smile to Sochi's face. Michikoto's cousin did love her coffee. But before the great coffee conflict could continue, Ian approached them both. Well, I have some news for you both. First, I just got done with my adjustment. My employers will be able to salvage quite a bit from Naglfari. As of this time tomorrow, Major Goal Inc. will own the Naglfari and all of its contents, he and Avid told them both. Also, the doctors wanted me to tell you Michikoto is going to be okay. The doctor said he'll need to take it easy for a few weeks, but he'll be alright. Sochi stopped caring about the coffee with those words and smiled. That's wonderful, she said. She was so happy with the second piece of news. She had no time to think about the first piece of news. As the sun began to set on the Naglfari and on the hunters who helped clear it.